Chapter 2984. In the beginning, he had merely condensed all the source of killing intent that his clone had refined into that tiny vortex and reconstructed it according to the method of the vortex formed by the will of the world. He had already completely refined this bit of source of killing intent, so it was naturally very easy for him to control it. After that, he used the empty will produced by the vortex to control the source of the baleful aura outside the vortex, gathering more baleful aura and building an even bigger vortex around the vortex, thus producing an even stronger empty will. This new vortex was only slightly larger than the original vortex, but it was still under the control of the empty will. After that, the process continued to repeat itself. The vortex grew larger, and the empty will grew stronger. The strengthened will could control even more source of killing intent, which then condensed into a larger vortex. This larger vortex would then produce an even stronger empty will. Just like that, after countless cycles, it formed a vortex of this scale and such a powerful empty will. If Luo Fan's control was unlimited, then this process could continue forever until all the source of killing intent in the entire calamity was completely under his control, and everything became a part of the vortex. However, it was clear that although Luo Fan's control was strong, and the strength of his willpower was astonishing, it was not limitless after all. The larger the vortex, the stronger the empty will, and the more difficult it was for him to control it. At this time, when the vortex had grown to this scale, Luo Fan already felt a little powerless. It felt like an ordinary person holding a huge hammer that weighed thousands of kilograms. Right now, he could only use the iron hammer according to its original inertia. Once the iron hammer stopped, he might break his waist if he wanted to move it again. Even so, it was not safe. If he used the wrong amount of strength, he might let the iron hammer smash his head. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan was doing his best to prevent the vortex from continuing to grow. He wanted to control the vortex at this scale. However, it was clear that the inertia had already formed. Even if he tried his best to control it, it would not be easy to stop it. At this time, the growth of the vortex was suppressed by Luo Fan. Although it had slowed down a little, it still did not stop, and its scale was still growing. Under the tearing force of the vortex, the murderous aura on the humanoid figure was continuously being torn apart and thrown into the vortex. As the vortex stirred it, the imprint of the will that was simulating the state of chaos was completely destroyed, turning it back into the original murderous aura and fusing it into the vortex. Even though he knew that Luo Fan's method was quite strange, the evil figure did not have the mind to pay attention to anything else at this time. He just kept retreating, trying his best to stay away from the range of the vortex. Unfortunately, the effect was quite limited. They were in the midst of a great tribulation, and everything here was constructed from the source of baleful energy. In this place, time, space, matter, energy, and everything else was determined by the source of baleful energy. In such a mystical place, distance was obviously completely different from a place with the concept of space. In a place with the concept of space, distance was just retreating and constantly moving away from something in space. However, in this source of baleful energy, distance was attached to the source of baleful energy, and the effect of distance was achieved by constantly adjusting the source of baleful energy. This kind of adjustment was extremely subtle, and it was an adjustment to the special existence of time and space in the source of baleful energy. Under this kind of adjustment, no matter how far the humanoid figure hid, the source of baleful energy would still exist. In other words, no matter how he dodged or retreated, there would definitely be a source of baleful energy between him and the vortex. In this way, no matter how the baleful aura humanoid figure dodged, it was impossible for it to completely escape the suction force of the vortex. At the very most, he could only slightly weaken the suction force. At this moment, in another direction, where the world of laws was, it was also affected by the vortex. Wisps of origin baleful chi continued to escape from the world of laws that had completely transformed into origin baleful chi. They were then sucked into the vortex by the suction force, before being crushed by the vortex and turning into origin baleful chi that flowed into the interior of the vortex, becoming nutrients for the vortex's growth. As expected, I've lost control. At this moment, in the world of laws, Luo Fan's true body side. Although he had expected this possibility, the pressure from the blank will was still too great. The entire process of losing control was many times more straightforward and faster than he had imagined. However, although the vortex had already lost control, he actually didn't regret it. Even if he had lost control, he still had a contingency plan and could still use the situation to achieve his goal. Even if it wasn't as satisfying as the perfect state he had envisioned at this time, he didn't make the world of laws avoid the vortex. Instead, he took the initiative to control the world of laws and rush towards the vortex. During this process, the damage the vortex caused to the world of laws continued to increase. The amount of source baleful energy that was torn from the world of laws also continued to increase. The many parallel locations outside the main body of the world of laws, the many possibilities of the world of laws, were crushed one after another and turned into source baleful energy that was devoured by the vortex. However, Luo Fan still had some control over the blank will of the vortex. Although the vortex couldn't avoid causing damage to the world of laws under his control, the speed of destruction clearly hadn't reached the limit that the vortex could achieve. At the very least, compared to the damage suffered by the humanoid figure, the damage suffered by the world of laws was several times slower. The restriction that Luo Fan's will had on the vortex continued to weaken as time passed, and the speed at which the world of laws was damaged also continued to accelerate. In the end, when the world of laws really came into contact with the vortex, more than half of the countless parallel locations outside had been completely crushed and turned into source baleful energy that was devoured by the vortex. At this moment, the humanoid figure seemed to have thought of something and roared, "Don't even think about it." As he roared, he actually stopped retreating. Instead, he turned around and pounced towards the world of laws in an attempt to stop the world of laws. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "It's too late." As he spoke, the law of heaven and earth had already rushed into the vortex and began to move rapidly towards the center of the vortex, according to the vortex's circulation mechanism. Just as the world of laws was completely submerged into the vortex, the palm formed from the baleful aura appeared at its original position, grabbing nothing but air. However, the palm couldn't stay there for long. Soon, it had no choice but to collapse the palm, because if it didn't collapse the palm, its entire body would be sucked into the vortex. Although Luo Fan had painstakingly tried to throw the world of laws into the vortex, and he could vaguely tell what Luo Fan was thinking, it didn't mean that he was confident that he could do what Luo Fan had done. After all, this vortex was formed under the guidance of Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that he had special authority here. In comparison, he didn't have that kind of authority, and throwing himself into the vortex would definitely be suicide. Inside the vortex, the strangling power produced by the source baleful energy naturally became stronger. However, at the same time, the authority that Luo Fan's will could exert was also stronger in the vortex. Therefore, although the world of laws inside the vortex seemed more dangerous than the outside, in fact, it was much easier than the outside. From a distance to the location where the vortex wanted to come into contact with, the world of laws would lose half of its possibilities. However, from the edge of the vortex to the center of the vortex, to the destination that Luo Fan originally wanted to reach, the world of laws would only lose half of its possibilities. The main body of the world was still unharmed, and it didn't suffer much damage from this journey. The moment the world of laws fell into the center of the vortex, the strangling power that had been constantly eroding the world of laws disappeared without a trace. The surroundings became incomparably calm. Not only did the world of laws not suffer any damage, but it also began to recover continuously. All kinds of possibilities and parallel locations began to be born continuously. In this special place where there was no time or space, an unknown amount of time had passed. The world had completely recovered, and all the damage they had suffered in order to rush to this location, as well as all the parallel dimensions that had been destroyed and all possibilities had been completely restored. Among them, there were even the various existences that Luo Fan had previously sent into the parallel planes that had completely disappeared along with the other parallel planes. This included the predecessor of the world's will, as well as the heavenly Tao of the world of laws. The last step is complete. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. He extended his perception outwards, and in the blink of an eye, he had a clear view of the situation of the vortex. At this moment, the vortex seemed to have an additional axis. Although it spun faster and the suction force became stronger, it seemed to have become more stable instead. The place where the strangling power of a vortex was the weakest was the center. In other words, it was the position occupied by the world of laws at this time. It could be said that in the entire great calamity, only the center was truly unaffected by the strangling power of the vortex. Apart from this position, no other position could avoid the influence of the vortex, nor could they avoid the suction and strangling power produced by the vortex. At this moment, the fiendish humanoid figure was already trying his best to escape the vortex, hiding in an extremely distant place to avoid the vortex's influence. However, it was clear that no matter how he dodged, as long as he was within the source ominous aura, he couldn't avoid the suction of the vortex. The source ominous aura on his body was constantly being sucked out, turning into strands of light that were constantly sucked into the vortex and turned into a part of it. In terms of scale, the vortex had already occupied more than half of the source ominous aura within the entire great calamity. Although a large portion of the ominous aura within the fiendish humanoid figure had been completely assimilated by the will that simulated the state of chaos, it still couldn't reverse the process of collapse and destruction. However, he was unable to reverse the entire process of collapse and destruction. He could only watch helplessly as his body continued to crumble. In the end, it still became so violent. The fiendish humanoid figure suddenly sighed at this moment. The act of building a vortex to annihilate him was clearly extremely violent compared to the previous method of simulating the state of chaos, the endless worlds, the endless creators, the endless divine abilities, and the infinite power. It could even be said that it didn't contain any technical content. For existences of their level, using such untechnical methods to determine the victor clearly didn't have much beauty. At the very least, for the will that simulated the state of chaos, it didn't have much beauty. Rumble. As he sighed, the new state of chaos that covered his body finally completely collapsed. At a glance, the dusky luster that covered the fiendish humanoid figure's body was gradually being erased. As the dusky luster was erased, the body of the fiendish humanoid figure shrunk by more than half. However, although it had shrunk by more than half, its strength had clearly increased by a lot. The amount of source ominous aura that was pulled out by the vortex's suction force was much less than before. Of course, no matter how little it was, there's still some. After all, the body was still a part of the source ominous aura, and it couldn't avoid the fate of being pulled out by the vortex's suction force. However, the fiendish humanoid figure's expression had already returned to its original calm. Chapter 2985. This was extremely similar to the process Luo Fan had used to create the vortex. However, compared to the vortex created by Luo Fan, the vortex in front of him was a little different. It seemed to be more agile and natural. It was as if this was the real deal. The vortex that Luo Fan had created, which had forced the evil humanoid figure to retreat to this position, was just a replica. After the illusory image of the vortex took shape, it began to rapidly absorb the surrounding source evil aura and gradually became more and more realistic. Immediately afterwards, the ominous aura figure collapsed with a loud bang. The will that had fused with the ominous aura figure dispersed and began to rapidly pour into the vortex that had just formed, pushing the vortex to spin faster and faster. More and more origin baleful chi was continuously poured into the ominous aura vortex, causing it to expand even faster. Let's decide the victor. At that moment, a voice came from the vortex. These words were so grand and mysterious that after they came out, they were directly transmitted to Luo Fan's ears, who was in another vortex. As the voice spoke, the vortex expanded even faster. The source of the baleful aura from the collapse of the baleful aura humanoid figure was completely absorbed into the vortex in just a few short breaths, becoming a part of the vortex. As this happened, the blank willpower that had been born in the vortex didn't even have the ability to stay for a moment before it was completely devoured and replaced by the willpower that simulated the state of chaos. Compared to Luo Fan's willpower, the willpower that simulated the state of chaos clearly had a stronger affinity with the vortex that was the manifestation of the will of the world. At this time, under his control, the rotation speed of this vortex was several times faster than the vortex constructed by Luo Fan. The suction force it produced was also several times stronger than that of Luo Fan's vortex. In this way, even though the vortex took much longer to appear than Luo Fan's vortex, it was not completely defenseless against Luo Fan's vortex. It was actually able to seize the source evil aura from Luo Fan's vortex every single time. However, as the vortex formed and the humanoid fiendish aura collapsed, the boundless source of fiendish aura that filled the great calamity seemed to gradually lose its free-flowing quality. Vaguely, it seemed to have become more purposeful. As if a master was gradually controlling everything from behind the scenes, an indescribable pressure appeared in the heart of Luo Fan and the willpower that simulated the state of chaos. This pressure came from the surrounding environment and the endless source evil aura, or, to be more precise, it was an even more subtle and obscure existence that existed behind the source of the baleful aura. You have ruined my plan. When the willpower that simulated the state of chaos sensed the appearance of the pressure, it became extremely furious. Obviously, although transforming into this vortex allowed him to prevent his fate of being completely devoured by Luo Fan's vortex, it also made him pay a great price, causing his original plan to be completely destroyed. Looks like I have to hurry up. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled. The pressure that appeared out of nowhere in his heart did not come from anything else but from his seventh great calamity. More specifically, it came from the true will of the great calamity. One must know that although the willpower that simulated the state of chaos seemed to be the will of the great calamity, it was already going against him as the will of the great calamity. But in reality, it was still a will born from the second derivative of the source evil aura. No matter what, it was fundamentally different from the true will of the great calamity. It was precisely because of this that it was so difficult for it to fuse with the source evil aura, and that there were so many obstacles. If it was the will of the source evil aura, why would it need so many messy processes? It only needed a thought to complete the entire process. With this flaw, the original behavior of the willpower that simulated the state of chaos could also be explained. No matter what, if it wanted to maintain the human form of the source evil aura, it was obviously a necessary step to completely replace the true will of the great calamity. If it did not maintain this state, the great calamity would abandon it, and the true will of the great calamity would be derived from the source evil aura. To Luo Fan, the emergence of this was only a change in his enemy, and there was no essential difference. However, to the willpower that simulated the state of chaos, the situation was obviously completely different. To the willpower that simulated the state of chaos, once the true will of the great calamity was derived, it was equivalent to having an immediate superior above its head. Moreover, it was a superior that could decide its fate. This was almost equivalent to making it lose control over its own fate. Obviously, no one would be willing to accept such an outcome. It was precisely because of this that it had such a strong desire to replace this will, and was willing to go through more trouble just to use the human form of the source evil aura to determine the outcome of the battle with Luo Fan. However, it was obvious that in the end, Luo Fan was still one step ahead. With the help of the method of constructing the vortex, the willpower that simulated the state of chaos was forced to be unable to maintain its human form. In the end, it could only give up on the human form of the source evil aura, release its suppression of the great calamity, and fight against Luo Fan. It could be said that the willpower that made this decision was equivalent to perishing together with Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan began to control the huge vortex and began to move towards the vortex that had just been born. The vortex could obviously be moved. After all, it was a mysterious existence that was formed by the will of the world. So how could it be like an ordinary vortex that could not move at all? However, even if such a vortex could be moved, its movement speed would not be able to reach an exaggerated level. Compared to a real living being, it was naturally far inferior. From the perspective of the vortex, its movement speed was at most like that of an ordinary person running. Of course, given the terrifying scale of the vortex, its speed was as fast as lightning. Faced with such a vortex, the willpower that simulated the state of chaos, which had loudly declared that it wanted to determine the victor between it and Luo Fan, did not move forward. Instead, it began to dodge. As it retreated, it changed directions. During this process, it constantly devoured the source evil aura that it passed through and did its best to strengthen its body and level. The willpower that simulated the state of chaos was not stupid. It clearly needed more time to truly grow. If it were to directly clash with Luo Fan now, it would be like a baby going up against a burly man. There would not be any suspense about the outcome. In comparison, it was obviously a wiser choice to avoid the brunt of the attack and grow wretchedly before fighting. The boundless source evil aura within the great calamity seemed boundless from the perspective of ordinary living beings. If any cultivator were to be thrown into any location, they might not be able to find the vortex that occupied a small portion of the entire great calamity, even after spending hundreds of trillions of years. However, it was clear that this was only from the perspective of ordinary living beings. For an existence that had reached the level of the huge vortex that Luo Fan had created, the location of the entire great calamity was nothing. In fact, it could even traverse the entire great calamity several times in a few moves. Under such circumstances, it would not be easy for the newly appeared vortex to avoid it. This was especially so when the vortex was still under Luo Fan's control. It should be known that Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts were so profound that even cultivators who had reached the Tao of martial arts admired and worshipped him. In this way, even if his speed wasn't too fast, it would be extremely easy for him to block the enemy and prevent them from retreating. Even though his enemy's willpower that simulated the state of chaos was extremely extraordinary, it was still the same. In just a few moves, the willpower that simulated the state of chaos suddenly realized that it had nowhere to hide. All the routes in the surroundings had been completely blocked by Luo Fan's vortex. No matter how it dodged, the next moment would be the moment when the two vortexes came into contact. Come on then. The willpower sighed at this moment. With this sigh, he no longer dodged, but instead went straight towards Luo Fan's vortex and slammed into it. Dodging for a short while wasn't a waste of effort. At this moment, the vortex had become several times larger and stronger than before. Although compared to Luo Fan's whirlpool, it was still countless times weaker. It was as if heaven and earth were being split apart. Countless worlds, space-time, and living beings were born out of thin air the moment the two came into contact. The worlds, space-time, and space-time that were born were not peaceful either. Two different currents were constantly fighting within them. The two different currents were guiding the worlds, space-time, and space-time towards different paths of development. If it was just one of them, it would be a great thing for the worlds, space-time, and space-time. It would allow the worlds, space-time, and space-time to bypass a lot of detours in the process of development and eventually develop to an unbelievable level. However, The situation was obviously completely different when the two currents appeared in the worlds, space-time, and space-time at the same time. The two currents were guiding and transforming the worlds, and space-time they were in. Naturally, there would be a strong conflict. This conflict, when manifested at the level of living beings, was a war. Of course, this was only the surface of what happened at the level of living beings. At a deeper level, in details that many living beings could not perceive, the two currents were also engaged in an extremely tragic battle, causing the worlds, and space-time to become more and more unstable. In the end, they did not even need to be crushed by the surrounding origin baleful chi. They had already been completely destroyed by the conflict between the two currents. At a glance, it was as if endless worlds, and space-time were born the moment the two vortexes collided. Then, in the next moment, countless worlds, and space-time were annihilated one after another in the endless origin baleful chi, as if they had been completely destroyed by the origin baleful chi. This process continued without end. No matter how many times those worlds, and space-times were destroyed, there would always be an equal amount or even more worlds, and space-times at the point of contact between the two vortexes, constantly emerging from the point of contact and shooting out in all directions. Moreover, the speed had reached an unimaginable level. In every instant, there were almost as many worlds, and space-time being born from the point of contact, just like the infinite worlds that had been born in the simulated primal chaos state. Of course, at the same time, there were also an equal number of worlds, and space-time being annihilated by themselves. The vastness and terror of this scene was enough to shock any living being. This included Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the empty willpower that was born in his vortex began to tremble violently. Indescribable pain continuously emerged from the depths of the empty will, quickly drowning it. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's expression became dignified. This situation was clearly a sign that the foundation of the vortex had already been shaken. At this point, Luo Fan and the simulated primal chaos state clearly had nothing more to say. The only thing they could do now was to fight to the death. Apart from life and death, everything else no longer had any meaning. At this moment, Luo Fan did not waste any more words. He directly manipulated the vortex and instantly released an incredible power that blasted towards the vortex in front of him. This vortex was constructed using the materialized will of the universe as a template, so it naturally could not simply have the power of an ordinary vortex. Within it, it even suppressed all the authority that the universes will possess. In other words, it was omnipotent authority. At this time, this kind of authority was directly stimulated by his method. It turned into endless spells, endless power, endless might, and endless light. It turned into countless rivers that crazily smashed into the new vortex. Chapter 2986. The changes of these rivers were even more complicated, strange, and terrifying than the rivers that rushed out of Luo Fan's vortex. The moment the two rivers came into contact, they triggered trillions of indescribable changes, and the final result brought about by so many changes was naturally trillions of changes. At that moment, the interior of the Great Tribulation seemed to have become completely different from before. It no longer looked like a Great Tribulation. Instead, it seemed like the boundless world and the boundless universe was waging a war on a scale that exceeded the imagination of all living beings. At this point, even the living beings who had witnessed the entire process of the battle would not be able to understand the situation of the battle. They would not be able to tell who had gained the upper hand and who had fallen into a disadvantageous position. Only when the final result was really revealed could they suddenly come to a realization and understand, oh, so this is the result. So those signs from before had this meaning. Of course, Luo Fan was obviously not an ordinary cultivator. As one of the parties in this war, it was naturally impossible for him not to see the situation of the war clearly. At this moment, He clearly knew that his vortex actually had a considerable advantage compared to the vortex that simulated the will of chaos. If the situation continued to develop like this without too many changes, the final outcome would definitely be him obtaining the final victory. However, it was very obvious that the situation could not remain the same forever. One must know that his enemy was the will that simulated the state of chaos that could tangle with him to this point. Judging from the previous performance of the will that simulated the state of chaos, even in the most desperate situation, he would definitely be able to find a way out. Moreover, the situation at this moment seemed to only be slightly at a disadvantage, and it was not to the point of despair at all. Therefore, it was obviously almost inevitable that the situation would change. Therefore, even though it seemed that his side had gained a great advantage, Luo Fan still did not relax. Instead, he still carefully controlled the vortex to attack the other vortex from all directions and eliminated the various means that the other vortex released. During this process, Luo Fan did not give up on fusing his various understanding of planes and dimensions. Among the many attacks, there was no lack of methods to split dimensions, break down confusion, and decompose other planes. Under such a variety of attacks, Luo Fan's side gained more and more advantages. At some point, the numerous rivers released by Luo Fan's vortex finally broke through a certain boundary and directly came into contact with the main body of another vortex. At this moment, the entire tribulation suddenly fell silent. Everything seemed to have been frozen, and there wasn't the slightest change that could continue. Immediately after, the whirlpool that was struck suddenly collapsed. The originally complete whirlpool instantly collapsed into countless whirlpool fragments. Luo Fan couldn't help but be stunned by this change. He originally thought that the will that was simulating the state of chaos would use some unimaginable means to turn the tables, just like what it had shown several times before. Previously, although he had used his full strength to destroy the vortex, he did not have much hope that he could really destroy the vortex. Deep down, he was actually waiting for the method of simulating the state of chaos to turn the tables that could appear at any time. However, at this moment, things were completely different from what he had expected. He had actually completed the plan that he did not have much hope for and completely destroyed the vortex constructed by the will that was simulating the state of chaos. How could he not be amazed? However, he soon realized that he had been wrong. The collapse of the vortex did not mean that he had already won. To his enemies, the collapse of the vortex was not necessarily a bad thing. At least, that was the case for the will that was simulating the state of chaos. At this time, the fragments of the collapsed vortex did not completely dissipate. Instead, they began to rotate again in the process and began to turn into small vortexes that were countless times smaller than the original vortexes. After these vortexes appeared, they began to frantically devour the endless source of evil aura around them, and they began to expand continuously. After taking shape, all the vortexes began to shift positions continuously. The distance between them and the other vortexes and their relative positions were constantly changing during this process. In the end, these countless vortexes actually formed an incomparably massive object in the midst of the endless source of evil aura. A massive human face. This again. At this time, Luo Fan suddenly laughed. This change was somewhat beyond his expectations. The instant these countless small vortexes formed a massive human face, he felt a strong sense of familiarity. Back then, when he had simulated the state of chaos, the birth and destruction of order to form a massive human face had clearly been a process like this. This change was actually the same as what had happened back then. However, this change was much grander and more stable. In the end, the human face that had taken shape was even more terrifying. Why should I give up on something that is effective? The massive human face said. At the moment, all the tiny vortexes that formed the human face were continuously devouring the source of evil aura around them. Every single one of them was continuously growing and strengthening as a result. Compared to the massive vortex that Luo Fan had constructed, these vortexes were naturally only tens of thousands of times weaker. However, this didn't mean that they were completely powerless against that massive vortex. In fact, a single tiny vortex was naturally extremely powerless against Luo Fan's massive vortex. If Luo Fan wanted to, he could easily crush them. However, when the number of these tiny vortexes increased to billions of them, the situation was completely different. Due to the unique structure of this massive human face, each vortex had a mysterious connection with the billions of other vortexes. This connection allowed any vortex to receive the protection and support of an unknown number of trillions of vortexes at all times. The effect of this protection and support was that when any vortex was attacked, the other vortexes would help it resist the attack and resist the attack together with it. Even though these countless tiny vortexes were much smaller than the size of Luo Fan's vortex, when all the tiny vortexes combined to form a massive vortex, they were still extremely powerless against Luo Fan's vortex. After this change, the massive vortex that faced Luo Fan was no longer as weak as before. This was like a rock. Originally, this rock was completely intact. In that case, as long as one's strength was increased to a certain extent, one would naturally be able to shatter the rock easily. However, if the rock had already shattered into countless fine grains of sand, it would obviously be hundreds of times more troublesome to shatter the grains of sand with the same amount of strength. Furthermore, if the grains of sand could still flow, it would be almost impossible to shatter them further with the same amount of strength. At this moment, the relationship between these tiny vortexes and the massive vortex was like the relationship between the fine grains of sand and the original rocks. Besides, it was still the relationship between the fine grains of sand and the original rocks. Under such circumstances, it was self-evident how difficult it would be for Luo Fan to shatter these vortexes completely. It could be said that with this change, the advantage that Luo Fan had over the willpower that simulated the state of chaos had completely disappeared. As expected, I can still find a chance to turn the tables in an impossible situation. Luo Fan sighed at this moment. The countless offensive rivers that surged out of the vortexes suddenly converged at this moment and disappeared without a trace, as if they were never there. At this moment, more than half of the huge human face formed by the countless vortexes was embedded in Luo Fan's huge vortexes, faintly interfering with the operation of Luo Fan's vortexes. Of course, at the same time, it was also disturbed by Luo Fan's vortexes, constantly changing and unable to truly calm down. At this moment, the huge human face sneered and said, "Do you think that you've seen through me? What you know of me is just the tip of the iceberg." As it spoke, countless strange lights were released from the countless vortexes, converging into a huge destructive light that smashed towards Luo Fan's huge vortexes. At this time, Luo Fan's countenance didn't change in the slightest. He directly condensed the incredible power of this huge vortex and transformed it into an exterminating brilliance, which fiercely smashed towards the brilliance. It produced an incomparably intense conflict with that brilliance, giving birth to countless unimaginable worlds, and space-time. The great calamity that had just calmed down not long ago once again fell into an unbelievable war that ordinary cultivators could not see through. At this moment, the endless source of baleful chi in the great calamity trembled at the same time. As this trembled, the countless worlds, and space-time that filled the entire great calamity were instantly annihilated. As these worlds, and space-time were annihilated, a large number of small vortexes that formed the huge human face were also annihilated. How can this be? At this moment, the huge human face could not help but turn pale with fright and exclaim. He couldn't be any clearer about where this sudden attack came from. The source of this attack was the main body that belonged to its seventh great calamity. In other words, it was the attack launched by the true will of the great calamity that had just awakened. This kind of attack was bound to appear, and the huge human face had expected this. Previously, It had actually mentally prepared itself for this. However, at this moment, when the attack finally appeared, it realized that this attack was completely different from what it had imagined. It was actually within the attack's range. In fact, compared to Luo Fan, who had triggered the Great Calamity, it seemed to be the main target of the Great Calamity's attack. This situation had clearly subverted its worldview, and it could not understand why this was happening at all. As expected, at this moment, Luo Fan, who had seen this scene, thought to himself, the will that simulated the state of chaos could not understand everything that was happening before it. It did not know why it was being attacked by the Great Calamity. However, as a bystander, he could clearly see and understand why the will that simulated the state of chaos would trigger the Great Calamity. In fact, he could not be more clear about why it would prioritize its attack over him. In fact, the reason for this was actually very simple. It was because the state of chaos had actually deteriorated. It was not the kind of deterioration that caused food to rot, but the deterioration of itself. In the beginning, when the will that simulated the state of chaos was born, it was to deal with Luo Fan and test Luo Fan. To it, as long as it could test Luo Fan and deal with Luo Fan, it would not hesitate to do so, even if it had to sacrifice its life or completely perish. Later, because of its selfishness in that great world, it had even sent another incarnation to replace the original incarnation so that it could carry out its mission again. Even if it had to perish together with Luo Fan, it had to destroy it. At that time, the will that simulated the state of chaos was still an extremely responsible tool for the Great Calamity, and it was still a will that had not deteriorated. However, at some point in time, the will that simulated the state of chaos seemed to have gradually changed. Perishing together with Luo Fan seemed to have unknowingly been removed from the bottom of its heart. For him, although he still hadn't forgotten his own mission, he still hadn't forgotten to test Luo Fan or to destroy Luo Fan. However, on this mission, the proportion of his ego had obviously become more and more important. For example, it had constructed the human form of order, birth, and death. This behavior was obviously not a choice that the will that simulated the state of chaos would normally make. One must know that constructing the human form of order, life, and death was obviously not done by the true will of this calamity, as it simulated the state of chaos. Chapter 2988. The remnant will that simulated the state of chaos laughed heartily and said, "Good. Since you want to spare, I'll give you to spare. I'll tell you everything I know. As for what you can find from there, that'll depend on your luck." As he spoke, a stream of information gradually dissipated from his will. The information contained within the information was obviously the information of a certain location that Luo Fan wanted. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly, and he instantly analyzed the information. So it's there. I should have thought of it. After reading the information, a look of realization appeared on his face. Then, he casually waved his hand, and the will that simulated the state of chaos flashed and was directly thrown into a certain parallel space in this world of laws. After obtaining this information, he clearly no longer had any interest in this will, even if he was interested in destroying it. At this moment, the world of laws had returned to its original state. Everything in it, including all laws, all energy, all time, and all space, had turned into the source of baleful chi. If any foreign living beings wanted to survive in this world of laws, they would either have to be given certain authority by Luo Fan, or they would have to adapt to the endless source of baleful chi. If an ordinary living being was thrown into this world by Luo Fan, they would definitely be directly assimilated by the source of baleful chi. They might not even be able to see the parallel space clearly before dying completely. However, it was obvious that this will that simulated the state of chaos was not an ordinary living being. It was originally an existence that could completely fuse with the source of baleful chi and snatch it from the true will of the Great Calamity. For someone like that, even if it was a stray source of baleful chi, as long as there was not too much of it, it would not cause any harm to him. Not to mention the baleful chi that had been completely refined by Luo Fan to form this world of laws in an extremely stable manner. At the instant he came into contact with Ping Xin, his will naturally surged forth and directly refined the source of murderous aura around him. It swiftly gathered together and formed a humanoid figure that completely enveloped his will, causing him to no longer look like he was in a pathetic state. As expected, it no longer has any interest in me. After coming back to its senses, the will sighed to itself. Then, he shook his head and threw everything to the back of his mind. He plunged into the parallel world of mortals, seizing the time to feel the myriad phenomena of the mortal world that he had never personally experienced before. In his opinion, Luo Fan wouldn't be able to live much longer. If he wanted to experience as many new opportunities as possible before Luo Fan died, he would have to seize every minute and every second. As for what the will that simulated the state of chaos would do in the parallel space, Luo Fan didn't care at all, just like what he had shown. Even if he was so heaven-defying that he could destroy the parallel world with the remaining power that was not even a billionth of his original power, it was still not enough to move him. To him, no matter how many parallel universes were destroyed, as long as the possibility of the world of laws still existed, it would instantly be reborn. Moreover, compared to the endless parallel universes, one or two parallel universes were so insignificant that they could be completely ignored. Even if they were destroyed, it wouldn't affect the overall situation at all. With such confidence, how could he possibly care about how the will treated the parallel universe? It could be said that throwing him into the parallel dimension was already a kind of reward for his cooperation. At this moment, he was already driving the huge vortex toward a certain direction in the Great Calamity. This Great Calamity was filled with the source of baleful chi, which was a mysterious existence that contained space and time. Directions should have been meaningless to such a source of baleful chi. After all, as long as the source of baleful chi was willing, it could change directions at will. But obviously, for the world of laws that could also control the source of baleful chi, directions were obviously meaningful. Even if it was an ordinary direction, as long as Luo Fan was willing, as long as the world of laws could fully exert its power, he could go in any direction he wanted, and he wouldn't be affected by the outside world's source of baleful chi. Not to mention, the direction he was moving in was not an ordinary direction. Instead, it was a strange direction that was constantly adjusting time, space, matter, energy, laws, and so on. In fact, strictly speaking, this was not a direction at all. It was only because the cognition of living beings had manifested that they regarded this kind of existence as a special direction. It was just like power. According to a truly accurate definition, there were actually many things and phenomena that did not belong to the category of power. It was only because the characteristics they displayed were extremely similar to the true power of a unique existence that they were called power. Of course, this was also the case for power. For a long time, many of the countless existences that Luo Fan had referred to as might weren't actually might according to a strict and accurate definition. It was only because they were quite similar to the nature of power that they were called power. Now, the so-called direction that Luo Fan chose was also an existence with the same nature. With the position information given by the will that simulated the state of chaos to guide him, the more Luo Fan controlled the world of laws to move forward, the denser the source of baleful chi around him became, and the stronger the abrasion and impact on the world of laws. In the end, when he moved forward to a certain position, the source of baleful chi in front of him had already increased to a state of solidification. At first glance, it was simply like an incomparably tall and heavy wall that no amount of force could break through. At this point, the source of baleful chi was destroying thousands of parallel places in the world of laws at every moment. That's right, it wasn't the vortex, but the world of laws. Because in the process of reaching this position, the wonderful vortex that had already fused with Luo Fan's world of laws had been completely shattered and devoured by the endless source of baleful chi. Now, Luo Fan's world of laws could only resist the endless source of baleful qi with the power of heaven and earth. This was because thousands of parallel places were being destroyed at every moment. Therefore, Luo Fan needed to let the world of laws derive a large number of parallel places at every moment in order to make up for these losses and prevent the main body of the world of laws from being damaged. This kind of derivation obviously consumed a lot of energy. This caused the energy concentration inside the world of laws to decrease at every moment. Energy concentration might have a complicated definition at other times, but here, in this world of laws that had returned to its origin, it represented the concentration of the source of baleful qi. At this time, the source of baleful qi was constantly being consumed, causing the entire world of laws to seem to become weaker and weaker. Then, the world of laws began to slam into the wall of baleful qi in front of it. The instant the two collided, an immeasurable amount of source malevolent qi splattered in all directions. The source malevolent qi contained an endless amount of energy, matter, and space-time. In that instant, it was as if the area around the point of collision began to form a cluster of worlds, a cluster of worlds. The damage to the world of laws continued to intensify. The speed at which the parallel places were being destroyed also began to accelerate crazily. Originally, there were only tens of thousands of parallel places being destroyed at every moment. But now, there were billions of parallel realms that were being destroyed in the collision at every moment. The wall was, after all, also formed from the source baleful qi. After returning to its origin, Luo Fan's world of laws had also become formed from the source baleful qi. The two existences of the same nature intertwined with each other, causing the world of laws to pay a great price before finally squeezing into the wall bit by bit. In the end, when it penetrated the wall and saw the existence behind it, more than half of the world of laws, including the main body of the world of laws, had already been destroyed. The countless parallel paths had naturally disappeared as well, destroyed by the thick Genesis baleful qi wall. This included everything that Luo Fan had thrown into the parallel places. In other words, the will that simulated the state of chaos that he had thrown into a certain parallel place before was also included in it. Of course, this didn't mean that the will that simulated the state of chaos had completely disappeared. In fact, after merging with the parallel place, the will that simulated the state of chaos had completely intertwined with the parallel place. Under this intertwining, as long as the parallel place existed, it could exist. The real meaning of this was that even if this parallel existence and himself had been erased, as long as Luo Fan allowed the world of laws to derive that parallel existence and that possibility again, then the will that simulated the state of chaos could be reborn along with that parallel existence. From a certain point of view, this was already another form of immortality. It's really here. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't pay attention to anything else. He just looked at the strange ball of light behind the wall. This ball of light was incomparably huge. Even the world of laws was like an ant standing in front of the sun. The ball of light released endless light and heat, and there seemed to be countless images changing at a speed that surpassed the reaction speed of all living beings. Suddenly, a voice came from the ball of light. "This is not a place where you should be here." Following this voice, Luo Fan felt the entire world of laws begin to tremble violently. The source of all the baleful aura that constituted the world of laws seemed to have completely betrayed his will at this moment. Under the influence of that voice, it actually began to lose its stability and gradually became chaotic. At this time, Luo Fan didn't have the mood to pay attention to the changes in the world of laws. At this time, he had completely lost his perception of the outside world. Although that voice didn't vibrate the baleful qi to derive the existence of the world, it was clearly more mysterious than those that could vibrate the baleful qi to derive the existence of the world. The moment the voice poured into his ears, Luo Fan felt that his mind had been completely suppressed. Only the voice had transformed into a myriad of strange senses that directly drowned him. At this moment, he had a feeling that he had completely fallen into an incomparably strange world. Endless light and shadows, endless smells, endless tactile sensations, and endless tastes drowned all his senses in an instant. Even his perception of time had completely disappeared. By the time he came back to his senses, he found that the remaining part of the world of laws had already re-embedded itself into the wall behind him. It looked like it was about to completely shrink back into the wall and completely disappear from the strange void where the huge ball of light was located. This change instantly made Luo Fan's hair stand on end. This was clearly because he couldn't even withstand the voice of that existence. Just hearing that voice alone almost made him lose himself completely. There must be a weakness. At this moment, this thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind. The existence in front of him was the true will of the great calamity. Moreover, it was a newly born will that couldn't even be considered too clear-headed. Such a will was equivalent to the true source of the entire great calamity. As long as he could destroy this will, then he would be able to completely bypass the endless source of ominous chi and win this battle against the great calamity. At that time, he only needed a single thought to eliminate this great calamity and completely transcend it. He would be able to break through the shackles of his realm and truly become a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Under such circumstances, the existence in front of him clearly couldn't be truly invincible. No matter how strong it appeared, it couldn't transcend the restrictions of this great calamity. In other words, it couldn't transcend the true level of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. In this case, the stronger it appeared, the greater its weakness was. And now, with Luo Fan's strength, it was obviously almost impossible for him to win against this will head-on. Therefore, he could only find the extremely huge weakness of this will. Only then would he be able to turn defeat into victory and obtain the final victory. With this thought in mind, he controlled the world of laws with great difficulty and gradually struggled out of the thick wall of ominous chi and returned to the huge ball of light. At this moment, the huge ball of light trembled slightly and said, "Looks like you're courting death." With these words, Luo Fan once again felt like he was about to fall into that strange state from before. At this moment, endless light erupted from his body and instantly enveloped him from head to toe. The voice was directly filtered out, and the various strange powers that affected his mind and five senses were completely filtered out. Genius 1 second, remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 2989. The light of heaven and earth was not an ordinary light, after all. It even had characteristics similar to the will of heaven and earth. Although the will of the light in front of him was different from the real will of heaven and earth, it was clearly of a similar level. In this way, it was also within the range of what the light of heaven and earth could withstand. Because of this, the light of the world was able to replace Luo Fan in receiving the voice that originated from that will. Only then was it able to filter out the various things within the voice that he could not endure, leaving behind the various things that he could endure and understand. Of course, even if it was filtered, the information left behind in the voice was still extremely huge. At this moment, when Luo Fan received the remaining information from the light of heaven and earth, he felt countless messy and complicated information surging towards him. It was almost like a boundless ocean wave that drowned him. Fortunately, he was already experienced in dealing with such information. Very quickly, he comprehended the meaning that the huge ball of light was trying to express. The whole process seemed complicated, but in fact, from the moment the huge ball of light spoke to Luo Fan, completely comprehending its meaning and what it wanted to express, only a moment had passed. In fact, it was less than a moment. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly, and he said, "I really want to die. Can you fulfill my wish?" His words were directly transmitted into the light, causing the will in the light to pause for a moment. Evidently, Luo Fan's answer was out of his expectations. Normally, no one would say such a thing in the face of a threat, unless they wanted to fool their opponent from the will's point of view, the gap between it and Luo Fan was obviously huge. As long as it could spare some effort, it could completely obliterate Luo Fan in minutes. Under such circumstances, making him believe that Luo Fan had absolute confidence in himself, that he could easily deal with him, and that he even had the mind to play tricks on him, was simply as absurd as asking a person to admit that he couldn't beat an ant. This absurdity caused the operation of the will to break slightly. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. He had already found the weakness of this will. Indeed, just as he had expected, the weakness of this will was not inferior to its strength at all. This weakness was none other than the extremely poor flexibility of his will. He seemed to be just a kind of machine, and could even be said to be an extremely elementary will. However, he did not retain any of the intelligence and cunning of the will of living beings. As for the true will of heaven and earth, it was something that he could not achieve. At this moment, it could be said that he was in a state where he could neither succeed nor be satisfied. In this state, his strength and might could reach an unimaginable level, forming an incomparably strong pressure on Luo Fan. However, at the same time, his thoughts, his will, and his ego had fallen into an extremely awkward state because of this. It could be said that he was at the lowest point within the lowest point. Such an existence was obviously not much of a threat to Luo Fan. No matter how strong he was, it was still the same. At this moment, Luo Fan did not hesitate any longer and used the best method at this moment. At this moment, the best method was to completely break down the will spirit and make its thoughts completely chaotic. As long as this goal was achieved, no matter how strong the will was, it would no longer be a threat to him. Instead, its own strength would become something that he could use, and in turn, help him completely destroy it. As for how to break down the will spirit and make its thoughts chaotic, it was simply a piece of cake for Luo Fan. He only casually took out a few questions that seemed to be very reasonable, but the conclusions he obtained were very absurd. With just a few words, it was enough to make the will at a loss. After that, he used some words to force the will to completely break down, and its thoughts would become chaotic. And he seemed to have done this. In this way, in just a short 2 to 4 hours, the huge ball of light in front of Luo Fan had already fallen into a state of chaos. As it became chaotic, the source of ominous aura wall that surrounded the area and completely sealed off the surrounding air began to collapse. It felt as if the foundation that formed the source of ominous aura wall had been removed. All of the source baleful chi began to collapse, and holes began to appear on the walls. As time passed, the holes grew larger and larger, and more holes appeared. In the face of such a hole, Luo Fan knew that his plan had succeeded. Next, he just needed to sit back and watch, and the ball of light would self-destruct. With a thought, the remaining small portion of the world of laws began to absorb the endless source of ominous aura around it, and it began to recover. In a short while, the main body of the world of laws had completely returned to its normal appearance, as if nothing had happened before. The reason why it went so smoothly was that the controller of the source of ominous aura had completely given up control of it, and the source of ominous aura had gained true freedom. Gaining freedom also meant that it was no longer protected, so it seemed like anyone could absorb and refine it. After that, Luo Fan didn't stop there. Instead, he continued to absorb the source of ominous aura and constantly push the world of laws to continue evolving. The many parallel worlds that had been destroyed before also began to gradually regenerate at this time. Unknowingly, the world of laws had returned to its original boundless and endless state. The various foreign objects that had died due to the destruction of the parallel worlds were also restored at the same time, as if nothing had happened before. At this moment, the incomparably huge ball of light in front of him had already exploded, turning into countless tiny balls of light that rushed towards the endless source of ominous aura around it. After these light fragments rushed into the source of ominous aura, they began to quickly fuse with the source of ominous aura and gradually gave birth to all kinds of strange creatures. They began to fight and kill in the endless source of ominous aura, carrying out all kinds of terrifying acts that were unimaginable to living creatures. These creatures were all formed from the light fragments, and they were originally one. However, at this time, they behaved like irreconcilable enemies. The reason for this was obviously because of what Luo Fan had said to the consciousness before. Those words had obviously caused the consciousness to fall into chaos. At this time, the countless fragments of the consciousness were the product of all kinds of chaos. Each fragment stood from a completely different perspective from the other fragments. They disagreed with the ideas of the other fragments, but were extremely firm with their own ideas. Under such circumstances, killing was unavoidable. The scope of this killing spread out further and further. In the end, all the source of ominous aura in the entire Great Calamity was drawn into this killing. The entire Great Calamity seemed to have fallen into an extremely chaotic Azura battlefield. Luo Fan, who had originally been the main target of the Great Calamity, was now free of any attacks. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did his best to avoid the creatures formed from the fusion of the fragments and the source of ominous aura as he waited for things to develop. In the face of this source of ominous aura, time was completely meaningless. Some of the creatures in the source of ominous aura hoped that time would last longer, some hoped that it would be shorter, and some even hoped that time would stop or reverse. Because they were meddlesome, the true consciousness of the Great Calamity had split into many fragments. Therefore, they all had great control over this source of ominous aura. This kind of control allowed them to change and manipulate the flow of time according to their will at will, as well as the flow of time. Therefore, at this moment, the flow of time in almost every location within the source of ominous aura was different from the other locations. When the creatures formed from different fragments came into contact with each other, their control over time would clash, ultimately resulting in even more powerful time disorder. Because of this, time became even more chaotic, and it became even more difficult to understand. Under such circumstances, there was obviously not much meaning in talking about time. In Luo Fan's senses, only a few days had passed. However, the creatures formed from the fragments of what might have already experienced billions of years. The battle between them had already been completed billions of times. Amidst such a battle, the victor between them had finally emerged. Obviously, there would always be a victor and a loser in a battle. This was the case even in a battle between these fragments of self. That will have been split into billions of pieces, and the amount of damage it had suffered during the battle was unimaginable. Many of them had perished together with the enemy. However, even so, the final victor would still stand out and truly stand on the corpses of the creatures formed from the fragments of will, standing in front of Luo Fan. You've made me suffer so much. The victor still looked like a ball of light. However, it had already shrunk by countless times compared to before. Moreover, its words no longer had the charm of needing to be filtered by the light of the world. Instead, it was just as powerful as the will that had simulated the state of chaos. From this, it was obvious that the will had fallen once again and had returned to the level of the will of a living creature. From a certain point of view, what Luo Fan had done before had clearly destroyed all of its efforts to sublimate and evolve, causing it to lose all hope of improving. Not to mention anything else. Just this point alone was enough to form an eternal hatred between him and Luo Fan. However, even though it had shrunk by countless times and had lost all hope of evolving to the level of the true will of the world, it was still not a bad thing. However, this decline was not entirely a bad thing for the existence. At the very least, under this influence, the life form possessed an incomparably agile mind. The various weaknesses that it had in the past had completely disappeared. At this moment, it was clearly more terrifying than before. At the very least, there was no doubt about this for Luo Fan. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. We are enemies, aren't we? That's right, we are indeed enemies. There's indeed no reason for us to coexist. Though we'll side at this moment. At this moment, the entire great calamity was already in ruins. The endless source of evil aura had already become sparse, like a wasteland. The extremely mysterious source of evil aura that had replaced everything had been completely broken. At a glance, the entire great calamity looked like a vast, broken continent. The scars of the battle filled the entire land. Fragments of the world, fragments of heaven and earth, fragments of space-time, fragments of rules and laws, fragments of time, fragments of space, fragments of living beings, fragments of information, fragments of memories, fragments of spirit, and everything else seemed to have spread across the entire continent. In this place, it seemed to have completely become the definition of broken. It was as if all destruction could be found in this place. And in reality, the phenomenon of all destruction could be found here. At this moment, the ball of light looked like the sun of this continent. On the other hand, Luo Fan's world of laws looked like a strange cluster of clouds above this continent. It was surging endlessly, and it was unknown how many kinds of strange clouds existed at all times. The confrontation between Luo Fan and that felt like the confrontation between the cloud and the sun. At this moment, an angry roar came from the sun. I will tear you into pieces. I will torture you for billions of years. I'm going to make you wish you were dead, but unable to. With such an angry roar, the entire continent suddenly collapsed. Everything within it turned back into a source of evil aura and began to frantically gather towards the ball of light, leaving behind countless huge rivers of source of evil aura in the void. It looked like hundreds of rivers flowing into the sea. In the face of such a method, Luo Fan just faintly smiled. Then, an endless source of baleful aura was released from the heaven and earth at the same time. It naturally evolved in the void and turned into an unknown number of billions of dimensions, completely swallowing the endless source of baleful aura into those countless dimensions. Following this change, incredible movements continuously occurred in the void and were constantly released. It looked like endless light and shadow, endless worlds, endless space-time, and endless heaven and earth were being born at the same time. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 2990. At this moment, the will of the Great Tribulation didn't seem weak either, and it seemed to be much stronger than Luo Fan's. But it was clear that the will of the Great Tribulation was hundreds of millions of times weaker than it was at the beginning. The degree of weakening was so great that it was equivalent to turning a towering giant into an ant that could be squashed to death by an ordinary person. As for Luo Fan, who had caused such a change in his body, it was self-evident what he was thinking. It could be said that at this moment, even if he had to use his own life to make Luo Fan suffer some flesh wounds, he would still be willing to do it. At this moment, he didn't care about anything around him, nor did he care about his own consumption. Even though his mind and will were burning like flames, he didn't relax and poured endless attacks on Luo Fan. Luo Fan's world of laws shook endlessly during this process. At this moment, the source ominous aura in the surroundings was gradually being controlled by the will of the Great Tribulation. It was getting more and more difficult for him to control it. It could be said that this was the best time for him to fight the will of the Great Tribulation. If he missed this opportunity, the longer it dragged on, the greater the disadvantage he would be at. Therefore, at this moment, he didn't retreat in the face of such an attack. The dimensions derived from the source ominous aura continued to increase, devouring more attacks into those dimensions and doing his best to weaken the impact of those attacks on the world of laws. However, the growth of the dimensions couldn't be fast enough to perfectly devour all the attacks derived from the will of the Great Tribulation. In the end, there were still some attacks that broke through the obstruction of the dimensions and directly collided with the world of laws, causing the world of laws to tremble and the outermost layer of the world of laws to collapse. Not long after, the entire broken continent was completely shattered. Everything on it, including the broken world, the broken heaven and earth, the broken sky, the broken laws, and so on, everything that could be imagined everything that could not be imagined completely collapsed in this process, turning into endless source of baleful aura that continuously gathered around Luo Fan and the will of the Great Calamity. Both sides divided it up and turned it into their own power, providing a source of power for their attacks and defenses. The will of the Great Tribulation naturally knew that it wasn't the perfect time to attack Luo Fan. It was the will of the Great Tribulation, after all, even if the majority of it had been destroyed due to the internal friction, leaving only a billionth of its original amount. But the will of the Great Tribulation was the will of the Great Tribulation. In this Great Tribulation, it was the absolute ruler. For him, the entire calamity was his nourishment. As long as there was enough time, it would be able to absorb enough resources to recover and even further grow, thus pushing itself to a higher realm. Therefore, it seemed that waiting for a period of time to fight with Luo Fan and take revenge on Luo Fan was a more appropriate and even perfect choice. However, the truth was obviously not that simple. If it was really that simple, why wouldn't the will of the Great Tribulation make a choice? It now had a complete and extremely intelligent will of life. Of course, he knew what was best for himself. Even when his heart was almost covered by hatred, it was still the same. Since that was the case, he had chosen to attack Luo Fan at this time. He had chosen to retaliate against Luo Fan at a time that wasn't considered perfect for him. Of course, there was a reason he had to do so. And this reason, when explained, was not complicated at all. It was because it was only at this time that it could be so clear-headed. In other words, it was only at this time that it could carry out its hatred so strongly and launch such a decisive attack on Luo Fan. Absorbing the endless source of evil aura in the surroundings to restore itself and even nurture itself again seemed perfect, but in fact, this process was also the process of being corroded by the source of evil aura. If it continued to grow like this, the many fragments of will that it had defeated and destroyed before would gradually be reborn and fuse with it again. Once that happened, then his will would once again be affected by those will fragments, and his thoughts would once again fall into the same state of chaos as before. In the end, it would completely forget about its hatred for Luo Fan and completely forget about going against Luo Fan. Instead, it would start to fight itself to the death. Obviously, this was unacceptable to the will of the Great Tribulation, which was willing to sacrifice its life to make Luo Fan pay the price. Therefore, even if the timing was not perfect, it could only choose to go against Luo Fan at this time and make Luo Fan pay the price. This actually had an advantage, which was that it could slow down its natural recovery. This was because it did not turn the source of evil aura into nutrients to nourish itself. Instead, it turned the source of evil aura into endless attacks that were thrown at Luo Fan. Without the source of evil aura to affect and nourish itself, it would naturally be able to maintain its current will for a longer period of time and maintain its purity. Of course, this was obviously just what it was thinking at this time. Given its hatred for Luo Fan, if it really felt that it could deal a greater blow to Luo Fan after it had grown and recovered, it would definitely not be stingy with its remaining purity. The endless origin baleful chi continued to give birth to countless incredible attacks. Endless worlds, and endless space-time constantly collided with the more and more dimensions that were born around Luo Fan's world of law. Then, the origin baleful chi was constantly divided by those dimensions and turned into many layers of attributes. Then, the origin baleful chi was crushed and erased by those dimensions. This process continued for tens of thousands of years. Of course, this was during the tens of thousands of years that Luo Fan and the Great Tribulation had been experiencing. As for how long this period of time had been, neither of them knew, even if it was relative to the Great Tribulation. In fact, neither of them could be sure how long this period of time had been relative to each other. With the origin baleful chi in such a state of chaos, time had naturally become extremely chaotic as well. Although the dimension of time still existed, it had been thrown into disarray. It was no longer possible for all living beings, all things and all powers to be in this great tribulation to be consistent. Therefore, the time that they felt between each other was only their own perception. It was the product of their perception of time, quantifying the changes in the outside world. This perception of time told them that their battle had already been going on for tens of thousands of years. During this period of time, the attacks that they had exchanged were calculated in the trillions of trillions. If an ordinary living being saw such a terrifying number, it was likely that they wouldn't be able to accurately count the specific and precise numbers. On this day, Luo Fan let out a soft cry. The endless dimensions, which had already expanded to a terrifying degree that even he couldn't clearly count, suddenly expanded and directly devoured the sun, suspended in the boundless source of evil aura. The sun was naturally the remnant of the Great Tribulation's will. It was purely the remnant of the victor of the Great Tribulation's level of willpower. At this moment, the Great Tribulation's will was extremely shocked. It completely didn't expect that Luo Fan, who had been in a stalemate with it for tens of thousands of years and had exchanged billions of attacks and defenses, would suddenly be able to do this. Luo Fan was actually able to break through its endless defensive means and directly pull it into the complicated and indescribable division of dimensions. This change completely exceeded its expectations of Luo Fan. It felt as if it suddenly didn't know the opponent that it had been fighting with for tens of thousands of years. Immediately afterward, it suddenly discovered that its body had been divided into countless parts, but from a certain point of view, it still seemed complete. However, from another point of view, it was already riddled with holes and had been divided into billions of trillions of thin layers. At this moment, it suddenly understood that everything was already beyond its control. It was just about to ask how Luo Fan did it. However, after a glance, it knew that it was no longer necessary for it to ask anymore, because it had completely understood how Luo Fan did it. At this moment, Luo Fan had already appeared in front of it without any concealment. There was only a layer of extremely strange heaven and earth light around his body, as if there were countless overlapping images of heaven and earth light. Apart from that, the heaven and earth and the endless source of evil chi had all disappeared without a trace. No matter what, the Great Tribulation's will was the will of a creature that had reached an extremely high level of intelligence. At this moment, how could it not understand what was going on? It was clear that Luo Fan had already turned everything except himself into the driving force of the dimensional division method, turning everything into a source of power for the dimensional division method. Through this huge sacrifice, the dimensional division method suddenly increased to such a great extent. In the end, it directly broke all of its defensive means and completely brought its body into the scope of the dimensional division method. At this moment, the Great Tribulation's will suddenly felt that everything was dull in its side. At this moment, the Great Tribulation's will suddenly felt that everything was dull in its side. Hearing this, Luo Fan was not moved at all. He only said, "Actually, I should have one a long time ago. From a moment my cultivation realm increased to the peak of the 7 tribulation, I should have one." At this moment, Luo Fan was extremely clear-headed. The Great Tribulation, this time, was really too long, and there were too many suspicious points in everything that happened in this overly long tribulation. He originally could not figure out these suspicious points, but at this moment, when he completely suppressed the Great Tribulation's will, he saw everything clearly and truly confirmed the existence of these suspicious points. Among them, the biggest suspicious point was that this was only his 7th Great Tribulation, but he actually raised his cultivation realm to the peak of the 7 tribulation in this Great Tribulation and could not break through. Compared to this suspicious point, all the other random suspicious points seemed insignificant. For cultivators who cultivated the righteous path, there might be countless standards for a 7 tribulation powerhouse, but for him who walked the reverse path, there was only one standard for a 7 tribulation powerhouse, and that was to pass the 7th Great Tribulation. Under normal circumstances, He could only become a seventh tribulation powerhouse if he really passed the seventh great tribulation. Or conversely, as long as he became a seventh tribulation powerhouse, he should be able to pass the seventh great tribulation extremely easily. But what was the reality? The reality was that in the end, not only did he become a seventh tribulation powerhouse, but he also reached the peak of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. In fact, it was only because of the shackles of the Great Tribulation and the suppression of the chaotic state that he could not progress further and become an eighth tribulation powerhouse. But even so, he still could not break through the shackles and pass this Great Tribulation. This was obviously an extremely abnormal situation. This was also the biggest suspicious point in this Great Tribulation. It seems that you did not study anything from those memories. At this moment, the Great Tribulations will laughed out loud. What do you mean? Luo Fan furrowed his brows. Did this mean that if he understood the nature of the Great Tribulation, he would be able to clearly understand why this suspicious point appeared? In other words, this suspicious point was actually not a suspicious point, but a special mechanism of the Great Tribulation. What does this mean? You will have to find out yourself. Do you think I will be so enthusiastic to solve your doubts? The enmity between us is not something that can be resolved just because you say so. The Great Tribulations will smiled viciously. When Luo Fan heard this, he could not help but sigh. He knew that it was no longer possible for him to get the information he wanted from the Great Tribulation's will. Unless he could completely obtain the memories of the Great Tribulation's will, however, he believed that the Great Tribulation's will would not give him such a chance. Just as he was thinking about this, a strange rumble suddenly emerged from the Great Tribulation's will. Along with this rumble, the Great Tribulation's will became empty, and its aura was no longer restricted or concealed. It was as if it wanted to burn everything and spread out in all directions and scrupulously. This was the result of the Great Tribulations will completely erasing all its memories. In other words, just as Luo Fan had expected, the Great Tribulations will did not give Luo Fan any chance to obtain its memories. It used the most decisive method to stop him. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 2991. Luo Fan could only sigh as he watched the will of the Great Calamity completely destroy his memories. It was extremely difficult for ordinary living beings to destroy their own memories. This was because ordinary living beings did not have enough control over their own bodies to the point where they could manipulate their own memories at will. However, for beings at Luo Fan's level, their own bodies were the things that they had the most control over compared to other external objects. For such an existence, wiping one's own memories could be done with just a thought. There was no time for any external force to interfere during the entire process. Just like now, even if Luo Fan wanted to stop the will of the Great Calamity from destroying his memories, there was nothing he could do. No matter what he did, it was impossible for him to be faster than the speed at which the will of the Great Calamity was destroying his memories. Unless Luo Fan was 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 times stronger than he was now, it would be impossible for him to stop the will of the Great Calamity from destroying his memories faster than it could. Luo Fan knew that he would not be able to stop the will of the Great Calamity once it had made up its mind. Even so, he did not regret not stopping the will of the Great Calamity. At this moment, he quickly adjusted his state of mind. Following this, he turned his gaze to his surroundings. The endless source of evil aura around him had already started to dissipate. It was as if the invisible existence that had bound the source of evil aura had suddenly disappeared. Faintly, a blurry color appeared in the surroundings. It was as if the source of the baleful aura was gradually disappearing, gradually turning into an illusion. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan understood that the Great Calamity this time had already been passed by him. Just as the will of the Great Calamity had said, at this moment, everything that he had experienced in this Great Calamity flashed through his mind continuously. This was truly an unprecedentedly long calamity. He sighed to himself, but he did not intend to stay in this Great Calamity any longer. With a thought, his entire body shone brightly. Following this, in the endless dimensions around him, a brand new dimension was created by this light. Or rather, they were opened up by the light. That brand new dimension was so strange. It seemed to contain the mysteries of all the other dimensions, but it also seemed to completely reject all other dimensions. None of the attributes of all the other dimensions existed in this dimension. This is the place. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and he had already stepped into the dimension. As he stepped into that dimension, all the other dimensions began to collapse and disappear. Not long after, all the dimensions disappeared, leaving behind a brand new dimension that seemed to contain all the characteristics of the dimensions, yet did not seem to involve any of the attributes of the dimensions. This dimension was empty. It was as if time and space did not exist, and there were no rules or laws. At first glance, it was like absolute nothingness. However, upon closer inspection, one would be able to sense the infinite vastness and complexity of everything behind the nothingness. With a slight movement in his heart, Luo Fan raised his hand and gently tore the void apart. As the void was torn apart, he discovered that he had appeared in a completely unfamiliar place. The restraints and shackles that had always existed in the Great Tribulation had disappeared without a trace. His entire body felt so relaxed, so harmonious, and so complete. It was as if he had reached an unprecedented peak. Following this, an inexplicable feeling appeared in his heart. The 8th Great Tribulation is in 8 billion years. This feeling was the time when his 8th Great Tribulation would descend. Obviously, this meant that he had already passed through his 7th Great Tribulation. This was also the first time after passing through so many great tribulations that he could immediately sense the exact time when the next Great Tribulation would descend. Right now, he would need to cultivate for at least tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, before he could vaguely sense the arrival of the next Great Tribulation. After this, he would have to cultivate for an even longer period of 4 months. Only then would he be able to clearly sense the time the great calamity would descend. But now, he had completely bypassed the previous few processes and directly confirmed the exact time when his next Great Tribulation would descend. This was enough to show that the 7th Great Tribulation that he had passed through was completely different from all the Great Tribulations he had passed through before. At the very least, what he had gained from this Great Tribulation was completely different from all the Great Tribulations he had passed through in the past. 8 billion years. Luo Fan secretly thought about this number and could not help but sigh. This number was obviously just a reference. The time when the Great Tribulation would descend, what he initially sensed was only the deadline. In other words, it was the time when the Great Tribulation would descend if he did not cultivate at all and did not improve himself at all. However, once he began to cultivate and improve himself, the time when the Great Tribulation would descend would continue to shrink. Moreover, the faster he improved, the faster the speed of the reduction would be, and the more shocking the reduction would be. If he had an epiphany, and his cultivation realm suddenly rose rapidly, then the time for the Great Tribulation to descend would be reduced to 0, and it would directly descend in the next instant. Obviously, Luo Fan could not cultivate and improve himself just to delay the arrival of the Great Tribulation. He was not that afraid of the 8th Great Tribulation to this extent. Cultivation was like rowing a boat against the current. If he did not cultivate to avoid the Great Tribulation, why did he not stop cultivating long before he became a tribulation expert? That way, as long as he did not improve himself, there would not be any tribulations at all. He did not need to worry about when the Great Tribulation would descend. Puff! With a soft sound, he suddenly felt his body lighten again. The light of heaven and earth that originally wrapped around his body suddenly melted into the surrounding void and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. He faintly felt that there seemed to be an endless world, an infinite world, and an infinite space-time around his body. These worlds, and these space-time faintly contained the characteristics of his light of heaven and earth. It seemed to be another form of the light of heaven and earth. This is the sixth level of the Tao, sovereign path. With a slight movement in his heart, Luo Fan already understood where he was at this moment. Back then, he had triggered his seventh great tribulation in the process of ascending to the sixth level of the Tao, sovereign path. It was just like when he had faced several great tribulations in the past. Therefore, at this time, he had clearly fallen into the sixth level of the Tao sovereign path after escaping the seventh great tribulation. The changes in the light of heaven and earth in front of him clearly prove this point. It could be considered as indirectly proving his guess. The sixth level of the Tao sovereign path had already begun to refine the light of heaven and earth. At this level, the light of heaven and earth was clearly not the same as before and could only appear in the form of light of heaven and earth around the cultivator. In this level, the various powers of the light of heaven and earth could already be extracted and devoured by the cultivator. The sixth level of the Tao sovereign path that could cause such a change must be closely related to the light of heaven and earth, and had a great impact on the light of heaven and earth. And clearly, at this moment, the changes in Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had confirmed his guess. The light of heaven and earth had indeed undergone such a huge change here, and everything seemed so natural, as if it was only natural. This clearly further proved that this place that he was completely unfamiliar with was the sixth level of the Tao sovereign path. Without the suppression, it is indeed comfortable. Suddenly, Luo Fan sighed. There was no other reason for this. It was just that during the few changes just now, he could vaguely feel that his cultivation realm had improved again. Vaguely, he had already broken through the shackles of the seventh tribulation expert and was about to step into the eighth tribulation expert. However, because he had just passed through the seventh great tribulation, he still did not have much of an understanding of the various aspects of the eighth tribulation expert, so he could not take advantage of the situation to make a breakthrough. Of course, this was actually not a bottleneck. As long as he could make up for this deficiency, he would naturally be able to make a breakthrough. Of course, it wasn't easy to make up for this deficiency, and the difficulty wasn't low either. His heart stirred slightly, and his perception swept in all directions. Finally, after stepping into the sixth level of the Tao sovereign path for so long for the first time, he clearly saw what the sixth level of the Tao sovereign path looked like. The entire sixth level of the Tao sovereign path was a boundless nothingness. Only a few stars dotted the endless nothingness, twinkling and slightly reducing the desolation of this nothingness. This scene seemed to be somewhat similar to the previous level of the Tao sovereign path that he had seen before. However, in essence, this level of the Tao sovereign path was fundamentally different from the previous level of the Tao sovereign path that was somewhat similar to this scene, because the countless stars that existed here were actually a certain world group, a group of heaven and earth, a group of space-time groups, or in other words, some kind of heaven. A single star represented a ray of heaven and earth light. At this moment, at a glance, the number of heaven and earth light in this nothingness was probably calculated in the hundreds of millions. Each ray of heaven and earth light represented an expert of the sixth tribulation. This also meant that in this sixth level of the Tao sovereign path, there were hundreds of millions of experts of the sixth tribulation. This number had far exceeded Luo Fan's previous imagination. There are actually so many experts of the sixth tribulation. It really deserves to be the foundation of a big world. Looking at the endless stars and sensing the inexplicable resonance with the heaven and earth light that was transmitted from the endless stars, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart. Compared with the other levels, the sixth level was obviously more unfriendly to the communication between cultivators. In other words, the sixth level itself seemed to not encourage communication between cultivators. It was as if it deliberately wanted to limit cultivators to a corner, to let cultivators talk to themselves, and to be alone with their own heaven and earth light. What on earth is in this nothingness? Then, this idea emerged in Luo Fan's mind. There seemed to be nothing in the endless nothingness around him, but in fact, it obviously contained countless things that Luo Fan did not understand or even recognize. These things formed a great obstacle for cultivators to walk. For cultivators, walking in this nothingness was obviously not as simple as walking in the ordinary nothingness. Even if he wanted to transmit information in this nothingness, it would be more difficult than transmitting information in any other environment, no matter how bad it was before. Even at this time, he could only sense the endless stars around him by relying on the resonance of the essence of the heaven and earth light contained in the stars. At this moment, an inexplicable message flowed into Luo Fan's mind from around him. It was as if his thought just now had triggered some inexplicable mechanism around him, causing that inexplicable existence around him to open up some information to him. Welcome to the 6th level, Taoist friend. You have 100 million years to consolidate your realm. After 100 million years, the test will begin. After passing the test, you will truly establish yourself on the 6th level. If you can't pass the test, please participate in the war. This information directly flowed into Luo Fan's heart. This information contained endless majesty, as if there was an incomparably vast figure speaking to him. Feeling such a message, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. Then, he could not help but reveal a faint smile on his face. Things seemed to be getting more and more interesting. For him, there was actually nothing in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road that he was afraid of. After all, the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road was prepared for experts of the 6 tribulations. It was built for the cultivation of experts of the 6 tribulations. And now, he was an expert at the peak of the 7 tribulations. How could he still worry about the various tests and dangers that were specially prepared for the 6 tribulation experts? How could he be threatened by them? Therefore, at this time, what he cared about was obviously not this so-called test. It was the emergence of this test mechanism and the so-called war. These two things were what he cared about. Who created this test? Is it the disciples of the Tao Master, or those Tao Masters, or the experts among the rogue cultivators? He thought to himself, and the smile on his face became more and more brilliant. Chapter 2992. The Tao Master's Path was built by many Tao Masters in the great Tao Master universe, that is, many true saints. The Tao Master's Path, which was born for such a reason, naturally could not refuse a Tao Master's tutelage. This kind of non-refusal included every level of the Tao Master's Path. It could even be said that if there was no Tao Master's tutelage, then it was very likely that the Tao Master's Path would not exist. It was the same for the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th levels. Therefore, the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path did exist, which also meant that there must be a Tao Master's tutelage here. And it was very likely that there was an extremely large number of Tao Masters under them. Judging from the foundation of a Tao Master's tutelage, they would definitely be able to obtain a great advantage in every level of the Tao Master's Path, and even occupy the absolute leadership of the entire level. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan linked the source of the information to the Tao Master's tutelage at this time. Of course, at least at this time, Luo Fan could only do such a guess. What exactly was going on? Who was standing behind all of this? What was the test? And what was the war? But he would only know in the future. After thinking for a while, Luo Fan put this matter aside. As the information just said, the most important thing for him now was to consolidate his realm. Although he was not like the ordinary cultivators who had stepped into the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path, who had just become a 6 tribulation expert, he had not only become a 7 tribulation expert, but had also stepped into the peak of the 7 tribulation expert, and could even sense the existence of the 8th tribulation accurately. However, this did not mean that he did not need to consolidate his realm like other cultivators. After all, his previous cultivation realms were achieved during the 7th tribulation. The cultivation realm achieved in this way did indeed belong to him, and it was a real realm that could indeed support him to go further and support him to continue to climb towards the true saint realm. However, the Great Tribulation was still a great tribulation. In the end, it was still different from the true state of chaos. The cultivation realm obtained from the Great Tribulation was still slightly different from the cultivation realm obtained from the true state of chaos. This difference was not a hidden danger or anything like that. For him, it did not bring about any irreversible consequences. It was just like a person who was familiar with a certain scented environment and suddenly entered a different scented environment. He would feel a little uncomfortable. Obviously, such discomfort would disappear after some time in a new environment. It was the same for Luo Fan now. There was a subtle difference between the Tao attainment realm achieved from the Great Tribulation and the Tao attainment realm obtained from the real state of chaos. In fact, he only needed to spend some time to recomprehend himself in the Tao Master's path and consolidate the realm, and then he could eliminate it. At this time, what Luo Fan needed to do was the process of consolidating his understanding. With all kinds of thoughts in his mind, Luo Fan sat cross-legged at the core of the heavens formed by the light of heaven and earth and closed his eyes. He began to carefully comprehend all the changes that had happened to his body. At this moment, his body had completely transformed into another form that was completely different from ordinary living creatures and even ordinary cultivators. His body still had all kinds of structures and mysteries that he knew of the Khanate Taoism aptitude. However, the composition of all of these was no longer the structure of the flesh and blood body at the beginning, but had turned into some kind of mysterious metaphysical existence. It was a completely indescribable form that seemed to include everything that could and could not be imagined, but also seemed to be just the simplest and purest body structure. There was also an incomparably pure worldview of the world that was contained in every smallest unit of his body. If one looked at it from a macro perspective, his entire body felt like a manifestation of the worldview of the world of laws. In other words, it was like a living creature of the world of laws, a Khanate Taoism body. Inside his body, time seemed to be flowing in an unimaginably special way. Every moment in the outside world could be countless billions of years compared to the inside of his body, but it could also be just a moment. It could even be that time had been reversed for a period of time. Endless power was being released from every smallest unit of his body at every moment, converging into a surging river that flowed around his body before disappearing. It was as if it had never appeared in the first place. At the same time, an endless amount of power was also surging out from the tiniest units. It also circulated around his body before disappearing into nothingness. At every moment, he felt as if his body was immersed in endless principles and mysteries. It was as if he had turned into a black hole that was constantly devouring and changing all the principles and mysteries that existed in the chaos outside that he could understand. With a slight thought, countless worlds, and space-time were created in his body, and they were quickly annihilated. Between creation and annihilation, there seemed to be countless indescribable principles being released into the black hole and absorbed by him. In the depths of his body structure, there was a Khanate indestructible spiritual light that flowed endlessly, as if it was suppressing everything. There seemed to be a boundless world within it. There was also endless information and mysteries contained within it. The innate, inextinguishable spiritual light had existed in his body for hundreds of millions of years, but it didn't seem any different from when it was in the beginning. It was still the same as before. Clearly, Tom had not left any traces on his body. This was actually natural. The Khanate indestructible spiritual light was self-contained, so no matter how much time passed in the outside world, it would not affect the time within it. Perhaps hundreds of millions of years had passed in the outside world, but only a few breaths had passed inside. Or perhaps only a few breaths had passed in the outside world, but hundreds of millions of years had passed inside. As for exactly how much time had passed inside, unless one personally entered, even Luo Fan, who was the owner of the Khanate indestructible spiritual light, could not be certain. Sky Maiden. With a thought, Luo Fan recalled the Sky Maiden, whom he had not spoken to for many years. At this moment, the Sky Maiden was still cultivating inside the Khanate indestructible spiritual light. Judging from her performance, the time that had passed inside the Khanate indestructible spiritual light was clearly not as long as the time that had passed outside. After all, the Sky Maiden had not even triggered the first great calamity yet. Under normal circumstances, although the Sky Maiden's foundation was much weaker than Luo Fan's. With Luo Fan's help, it was impossible for her to remain still and not trigger a great calamity if the time was calculated in terms of hundreds of millions of years. But now, it was impossible for that to happen. This also proved that the flow of time within the connate indestructible spiritual light was definitely countless times slower than the flow of time outside. At the very least, the time that had passed since then was not long enough for the Sky Maiden to trigger the first great calamity of the world. This situation made Luo Fan feel rather disappointed. However, he also felt a little relieved. Although he missed the Space Maiden who had been cultivating in it, the current situation was actually the best for them. After all, he did not have the ability to help the Sky Maiden with her tribulation. If the Sky Maiden triggered the great calamity at this moment, he could only wait by the side. She would either pass the great calamity or fail. Apart from that, there was no other way to change the outcome of her tribulation. Just the thought of this situation made him feel inexplicably frustrated. In comparison, the current situation was clearly more advantageous to him. Before the Sky Maiden triggered her great calamity, he would continue to grow and become stronger, and his techniques would become more and more brilliant. If he was lucky and the Sky Maiden triggered her great calamity when he became a true saint, the situation might change completely, and he might be able to influence the outcome of the Sky Maiden's tribulation. His encounter in the seventh tribulation had indirectly proved his conjecture. The power that was related to a true saint had actually participated in his great calamity. Even such a power that was related to a true saint could participate in other people's great calamities. If he became a true saint, could he not do this? However, there were obviously some mechanisms that he didn't understand, and there were even many fatal limitations. In the end, it wouldn't be as easy as he thought it would be. However, it was at least a hope. As for the things he didn't understand now, he would naturally be able to understand them as his cultivation level increased. This wasn't a problem at all. After looking at the inextinguishable divine light for a while, Luo Fan began to comprehend himself and consolidate his realm. This process of comprehension and consolidation was not easy. The amount of time it would take would definitely not be considered short. Compared to other practitioners who had stepped into the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, the time and energy he needed to spend was many times less. However, in the end, it took him nearly 100 years to complete the whole process. He thoroughly comprehended himself and consolidated his cultivation realm. As he completed this process, his body suddenly became bright. An endless brilliance sprinkled over the whole sky, formed by the light of heaven and earth. Then, an indescribable message swarmed toward him from the endless void around him. Congratulations on completing this trial with excellent performance, fellow Taoist. From now on, fellow Taoist will be able to freely do whatever you want on the sixth level. Fellow Taoist, you no longer need to participate in the battles for the various places of fortune. This was the first sentence contained in the message. This is the test. Luo Fan was slightly stunned. This was out of his expectations. He originally thought that the test would only start after 100 million years, but he did not expect that the time to consolidate his realm was the content of the test. He had actually managed to complete this test by accident. Interesting. After being stunned for a while, he laughed again. This kind of setting was quite interesting. At least, he felt that it was quite interesting. If an ordinary cultivator believed that the test would only come after 100 million years, and thus deliberately delayed the time needed to consolidate their cultivation base, even if they wanted to complete the consolidation process ahead of time, they would only be able to completely complete it after 100 million years. If they activated the light that would naturally be activated as long as their cultivation base was stable and unshakable, they would obviously suffer a great loss here. This test was equivalent to a complete failure. This sentence was only the beginning of the message. There was a lot of content after this sentence. This content was an introduction to the war that was forced to participate in if he failed the test. Through this information, Luo Fan finally understood what the war was about. is the war to fight for opportunities, he thought, and the look of interest on his face became more intense. That war did not take place in the 6th level of the Town Master's path between the Town Master's disciples and the rogue cultivators, but in the Town Master's path. In other words, it took place in the true divine path. It was obvious that during the process of cooperation between the true divine paths of the great worlds, each of them had left some backups in the places of opportunities that they had built. These backups caused the opportunities in the places of opportunities to be unevenly distributed, and even caused the opportunities contained in the different places of opportunities to be uneven. In this way, unfairness was naturally born, and the appearance of unfairness also led to the emergence of competition. There was no cultivator who did not want a stronger and more perfect place of opportunities. This was the case for the cultivators in the Tao Master Great World and the cultivators in the other great worlds. All cultivators wanted better places of opportunities, so they naturally could not take the initiative to hand over those places of opportunities to others. Want to get a better place of opportunities? Sure, but you have to fight for it yourself, and after you get it, you have to be able to defend it. Otherwise, you could just take away those places of opportunity that no one wants. Because of this background, in the fight for the Tao Master's path, or in other words, in the various great worlds, there would naturally be wars. At the beginning of the war, it might be extremely chaotic, but when a number of wars broke out increased to billions, all kinds of unwritten rules would naturally appear. Genius 1, second, remember this site address. Mobile version. Chapter 2993. The more wars there were, the stricter the rules would be. It was the same for the wars for opportunities. Now, when to start a war, how to start a war, the level of the cultivators involved, the situation of the war, the final judgment of victory and defeat, and the interest represented by each judgment had become fixed rules. Some of these rules seemed absurd and inflexible, as if there was something wrong with the people who made them. But in fact, the formation of any kind of rules was necessary. Before those seemingly ridiculous and inflexible rules, the parties involved in the war must have suffered a great loss because of this, resulting in a result that was unacceptable to all parties involved in the war. That was why these rules were formed in the end. Luo Fan looked at the huge number of rules and the information that made ordinary people despair, but he saw a grand war epic, as if a whole new world had opened up in front of him. A war in the state of chaos, a war between many worlds. He thought, with an inexplicable look of expectation on his face. With a slight thought, he turned his eyes to the heavens formed by the light of heaven and earth around him. In the process of transforming the heavens, the light of heaven and earth had obviously absorbed an indescribable existence from the endless nothingness around him. These existences had contributed to the transformation of the light of heaven and earth into what it was today. Such a transformation obviously made the light of heaven and earth contain some mysteries that were not there before. These mysteries were the cultivation goals of ordinary 6 tribulation experts in the 6th level of the road to Tao Master. They would use these mysteries to comprehend the further transformation of the light of heaven and earth, so that they could completely obtain some unique properties of the light of heaven and earth. Although Luo Fan had raised his cultivation realm to the peak of the 7 tribulation expert, in terms of level, he was already above the ordinary 6 tribulation experts. For him, the cultivation method of the 6 tribulation experts seemed to have little meaning. But obviously this was just what it looked like. In fact, for him, the cultivation method of the ordinary 6 tribulation experts was extremely meaningful. No matter how powerful Luo Fan was, no matter how invincible his previous performance was, it could not change the fact. He was a rogue cultivator. He was an itinerant cultivator without any inheritance or backing. For such a rogue cultivator, the only thing he could see was the ultimate supreme realm, which was the true sage realm. As for how he should walk between him and the true saint stage, which direction he should work towards, what path he should take, and what kind of scenery he should see along the way, even if he was not completely clueless about it, he could only see it vaguely, and it was difficult for him to really identify the path. If he really did not care about anything else and only focused on cultivating and improving himself, perhaps in the end, he would indeed be able to achieve his ultimate goal of becoming a true divine. However, he would have to go through countless detours. Furthermore, their chances of success would definitely be countless times smaller than those cultivators who had legacies and backers. This fact was enough to make anyone depressed, but it was the truth. Even if he was unwilling, even if he felt depressed, it was difficult to change it. This was also the fundamental reason why Luo Fan had to return to the Tao Master's path, no matter how far he had gone, even if he had gone to a place with a better cultivation environment. Because the Tao Master's path itself was a kind of inheritance, a kind of guidance. The setting of each level of the Tao Master's path completely displayed the key that an expert in the tribulation realm needed to master at each level. What needed to be mastered after the first major tribulation. As long as he completed all the tests of the first level of the Tao Master's path, he would naturally be able to master it. The second major tribulation, the third, the fourth, each major tribulation corresponded to each level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, as long as he followed the guidance of the Tao Master's path, he would naturally be able to master all the key mysteries that needed to be mastered after each major tribulation. He would completely consolidate his foundation and build a bridge to the next major tribulation. As long as he stepped on it, he would naturally be able to complete his cultivation. Obviously, Luo Fan had already realized this long ago. The reason why he did not continue to advance to a higher level of the Tao Master's path, but would rather hang around in a lower level of the Tao Master's path, was obviously not because he was invincible in the lower levels. The real reason was that he needed to consolidate his own foundation and thoroughly master the divine sense, power, Dharma access, and mysteries that he had not mastered in the lower levels. Only in this way could he build an absolutely stable foundation and steadily advance to a higher level. At this time, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was the same. Even if he was already in existence at the peak of the seven tribulation realm, compared to the six tribulation realm experts, he had not yet experienced the guidance of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path and had not completely absorbed the mysteries of cultivation contained in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, he could only stay in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Like an ordinary sixth tribulation realm expert, he slowly comprehended the mysteries of the sixth level and absorbed the various principles engraved in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. The heavens formed by his heaven and earth light seemed somewhat similar to the heavens and earth he had built before, but upon careful observation, it seemed to be different. First of all, in addition to the heavens and earth, there were countless worlds, countless spacetimes, and countless spacetime fragments. There were even many half-bit walls that could not even be called spacetime fragments. In addition, any heaven and earth, any world, any piece of spacetime fragment, and any half-bit wall were more complicated than the heaven and earth in the group of heaven and earth that he had opened up in a certain level of the Tao Master's path. At first glance, it seemed to be a little more complicated. Even if he was not careful, he would ignore this complexity. However, as long as he carefully studied it, he would find that behind the little bit of complexity, there was countless times more content than it seemed on the surface. It would be an exaggeration to say that the little bit of complexity revealed was just the tip of the iceberg. It could be said that this heavens was just a shell of the heavens and earth that Luo Fan had opened up. The specific content could be said to be completely different from the original heavens and earth. Of course, it was not completely accurate to say that it was a shell. At least, in this heavens, many traces left by Luo Fan could still be found. It was even to the extent that the cultivators he remembered and the creatures and races that still remained in his memories could be found among them. Everything seemed so mysterious, so miraculous, so specious, yet so wrong. Luo Fan's position at this time was at the central core of that heavens. This place was situated between the heavens and outside the heavens. It was an extremely mysterious and marvelous place. All the creatures in that heavens, whether they were strong enough to enter the tribulation or weak as ordinary creatures, could not find his existence at all. At least, when Luo Fan did not want them to find him, they could not find his existence at all. It's not a one-time absorption, but a continuous absorption, and at the same time, there are all kinds of wonderful existences being released, just like breathing. After carefully sensing, Luo Fan found something that he had not discovered before. This heavens did not just absorb the wonderful existences from the outside world at once when it was formed. Instead, it was absorbing the wonderful existences that existed in the void at all times, and at the same time, it was constantly releasing other kinds of wonderful existences. The process was similar to breathing. However, whether it was the absorption or exhalation, the amount was extremely small. At least, it was much smaller than when he first devoured those existences. Hence, Luo Fan did not discover it right away. He only discovered the absorption and exhalation when he sensed carefully at this moment. I originally planned to study the mysteries of the void later, but it seems like I don't have to wait anymore. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he smiled faintly. He did not give up on exploring the void around him or the source of the information. However, compared to those, it was more important for him to explore the heavens that were formed by the light of heaven and earth. Hence, he did not continue to delve into the void and did not continue to explore the source of the information. Instead, he set his goal on the heavens. Now, the development of the situation made him see the possibility of getting the best of both worlds. The heavens were constantly absorbing the wonderful existences that existed in the void, which actually caused the heavens to contain a part of the mysteries of the void. It might even have the key to the source of the information. If that was the case, he only needed to explore the mysteries contained in the heavens and solidify the foundation that he had previously lacked to become a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Then he would naturally be able to get close to the mysteries of the void and the source of the information. Furthermore, he would not even need to waste any time or energy in the process. It could be said that the situation could not be more perfect. No matter what, the heavens were formed by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. Even though Luo Fan's control over them had been greatly weakened after the transformation, the core authority could not be completely erased. Hence, at this moment, Luo Fan's perception of the heavens was still not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to. At this moment, he could clearly sense that after the wonderful existences that entered the heavens from the void around him entered the heavens, they began to split into all sorts of strange and indescribable wonderful things. They split and fused with the heavens and earth, worlds, space-time fragments, and half-dimensions in the heavens. Afterwards, all sorts of indescribable changes occurred in the places that they fused with. In the end, they fused with the indescribable foundation of the existence and became the source of it, becoming even more complicated. Faced with this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. His mind locked onto a certain existence that fused with the void and fused with the heavens together with that existence. In the process of fusing with the heavens, that mysterious existence began to split and split. In the blink of an eye, it split into billions of shares. After that, each of the billions of strands split into billions of strands once again. In this manner, it split layer by layer. In the end, it split tens of thousands of times before it completely fused with the heavens and earth, worlds, space-time fragments, and half-dimensions. During this process, Luo Fan's mind also split with every split. Fortunately, this was the heavens formed by his light of the world. If it was an ordinary heavens, it would be impossible for his mind to support this kind of splitting. Every time, it would split into billions of strands, and it was unknown how many tens of thousands of times it had split. The number of times that each strand of mind had split had almost exceeded the limits of what could be described with numbers. If it wasn't for the support of the all heavens, if it wasn't for the inexplicable replenishment that would flow into his mind every time he split his mind, maintaining the stability of his mind, he wouldn't have been able to continue splitting his mind after a few more times. If that happened, he would have completely lost the final destination for the existences that poured into the heavens. However, even with the support of the heavens, even if his mind was firm, and even if he could control it to an unimaginable degree, the number of splits was still too much. In the end, when his mind, along with those wonderful existences, completely fused with a certain world, a certain space-time fragment, a certain half-plane, his mind was still faintly discernible and even more blurry. Through the perception of his mind, it was completely hazy, and he couldn't see the surroundings clearly. It was as if his vision had been completely blinded, and his perception had been completely muddled. In this situation, even if it was just a complete mind, it was already quite uncomfortable. What's more, it wasn't just a single strand of consciousness that was in trouble, but billions and trillions of strands. Countless minuscule thoughts were mixed together, and even his main body's mind became hazy. It was difficult for him to clearly see anything that was happening around him. This kind of situation was somewhat similar to the blurriness after reincarnation before awakening. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 2994. The haze was like an incomparably deep nightmare. No matter how Luo Fan struggled, he could not break free from it. No matter how hard he tried, he could not break free from the haze and regain consciousness. In such a haze, even his perception of time gradually became blurry. He only knew that time seemed to be constantly passing, but he did not know exactly how much time had passed. Was it a moment, a few breaths, a few days, a few months, a few years, or even a few decades, or even centuries? This kind of haze was not unchanging. Instead, it was changing at every moment. It was as if his mind was constantly undergoing complicated and indescribable changes during this process, and was reacting to all sorts of indescribable complex things. The changes continued to appear, and it felt as if his mind was going through reincarnation after reincarnation in the countless worlds, space-time fragments, and half-planes. In a trance, he did not know how much time had passed. At a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt his body tremble, and the haze completely dispersed. His mind, which had been in a daze for God knows how long, became extremely clear again. Following this change, Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and it took him a while to return to his senses. After sensing for a while, he found that he did not spend too long in the haze. It was only 3 years. At this moment, his perception of the heavens in front of him was a little stronger than before. Earlier, at first glance, the heavens seemed similar to the group of heavens and earth that he had created back then. Only by carefully sensing and distinguishing them would he be able to analyze more and more complicated content from this similar appearance. But now, all these things that he originally needed to carefully sense and distinguish had become obvious to him with a single glance. At a glance, he could see a colossus that was many times more complicated than the worlds that he had created back then. The things that were originally hidden behind it had already surfaced. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had an inexplicable expression on his face. In his heart, he had already somewhat understood where his consciousness had gone when it had disappeared with those wonderful existences that had poured in from the void. Those minds had clearly completely fused with the surrounding heavens in an extremely subtle way. Through this fusion, his perception and grasp of the all-heavens had improved by a step. Therefore, he was able to see through the even more profound profundities hidden beneath the surface of the all-heavens with a single glance. This was just like how an ordinary person would feel when looking at something familiar and something unfamiliar. If an ordinary person looked at something familiar, as long as he saw it, his mind would automatically fill in the information that couldn't be seen from the surface. For example, because he was too familiar with a crack in a certain place, he would naturally imagine that there were similar cracks behind the crack that he could not see with the naked eye. He might even imagine how the crack was created. When such a crack was created, there would definitely be corresponding changes in other parts. For example, if this thing had been dropped before, then many parts inside would have loosened, and there would be marks in other places. In this way, it was as if he had seen many things that ordinary people could not see with a single glance. When it came to things that he was unfamiliar with, it was obviously not as convenient. Because he was unfamiliar with that thing, no matter how obvious the changes were, he was afraid that he would treat it as a normal situation. It was impossible for him to know what it had experienced, and even more so, he would not know what the corresponding changes would be at this moment. The change in Luo Fan's perspective towards the heavens was similar. Because his mind had fused with the heavens in a wondrous way, he had become more familiar with the heavens. His senses had naturally become clearer because of this. As for where his mind that had fused with the heavens was, he was still confused and could not find it at all. It was as if his mind had completely disappeared without a trace. Only that subtle familiarity made him certain that his mind did not disappear into thin air, but had fused with the surrounding heavens. It should be because I haven't fused enough. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Subsequently, he no longer hesitated and once again locked his mind on a certain mysterious existence that had fused with the heavens from nothingness. Subsequently, his mind was once again divided like the first time, and it was continuously divided along with a mysterious existence. Not long after, he fell into a state of confusion again. At this moment, another mysterious existence was sucked into the heavens from nothingness. Luo Fan was already mentally prepared, and he once again split a portion of his mind to lock onto that new mysterious existence. Just like that, a mysterious existence would be born from the nothingness in the surroundings every once in a while, and it would directly enter the heavens and fuse with Luo Fan's mind before it started to divide. It was a never-ending cycle. During this process, the division of Luo Fan's mind was naturally extremely serious. Compared to the first time, the mental consumption this time was thousands or even tens of thousands of times more. Moreover, because of the division of his attention, the time it took for his mind to fall into a state of confusion was many times faster than the first time. Of course, this was something that Luo Fan had already expected. But at this moment, he did not hesitate at all. He only maintained the most basic clarity and controlled his mind to fuse with the mysterious existence that was surging into the heavens, and he controlled his mind to undergo endless division with the mysterious existence. Apart from that, there were no other senses left outside. With the help of the heavens, this seemingly inconceivable process was naturally extremely smooth. In other words, the strands of consciousness fused with the wondrous existence that had fused with the nothingness. Then, as the wondrous existence continued to split apart, the process went extremely smoothly. However, in contrast to the smoothness of the process, his control over the details of the process was 1,000 times weaker than the first time. In Luo Fan's senses, it didn't take long for him to lose his sense of time. Apart from fusing his mind with the mysterious existence according to the previously set procedure, and then continuously dividing along with the mysterious existence, his mind had completely sunk into a state of confusion, and he could no longer remain clear-headed. During this process, time continued to flow. 3 years passed, and another 3 years passed. Unknowingly, 300,000 years had passed. During these 300,000 years, Luo Fan was always carrying out the actions he had set up at the beginning. He constantly separated his mind and merged with the mystical existences that were born from nothingness and then merged with the heavens. If it was an ordinary cultivator, even if they could do it, they wouldn't be able to last for a long time. This was because the consumption of mind at every moment was extremely shocking. After a few days, one's mind would be completely exhausted, and one's mind would completely collapse. However, it was clear that this was not the case for Luo Fan. As a peak 7th tribulation powerhouse, Luo Fan's mind recovery ability was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to. Coupled with his mastery of the connection between many planes, even if his mind collapsed, he could easily recover through the connection between reality and other planes. With all these conveniences, his mind recovery speed had reached an unimaginable level for ordinary cultivators. It could almost be said that the short interval between any two parts of his mind was enough for his mind to completely recover. In other words, every time he separated a part of his mind would be at its absolute peak state, as if it wasn't exhausted at all. Therefore, not to mention 300,000 years, even if it was 300 million years, 3 billion years, 30 billion years, 300 billion years, or even 3 trillion years, he would be able to easily endure it. He would never suffer the terrifying consequences of having a mental breakdown because of this. On this day, 300,000 years after he had made his decision, Luo Fan suddenly felt that there was a slight change in his haze. A subtle hint of clarity began to emerge from the endless haze. In an instant, he focused his attention on the point of clarity that appeared in his mind. This bit of mind was currently in the endless nothingness. Behind that mind was the heaven and earth cluster, world cluster, and space-time cluster that he was incomparably familiar with, and which contained an incomparably powerful aura that belonged to him. In other words, the many heavens. A heaven that belonged to Luo Fan. A heaven formed by the light of heaven and earth. It left the heaven. At this moment, Luo Fan understood what was going on with this part of his mind. Shockingly, this strand of consciousness had left the all-heaven world. But why? Why did this part of his mind suddenly leave that heaven? Where was it going? How did it leave the heavens? Questions popped up in his mind one after another, making him feel extremely puzzled. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. Experienced and knowledgeable was not even enough to accurately describe him. At this moment, he only needed to think carefully to find the answers to some of his questions. Among them, the answer to the question of how he left that heaven immediately appeared. His heaven clearly wasn't just constantly devouring the wondrous existences transmitted over from the nothingness. Instead, it was constantly swallowing the wondrous existences as if it was breathing. As it swallowed the wondrous existences, it also spat out another equally wondrous but completely different existence into the nothingness. However, previously Luo Fan had only been paying attention to the wondrous existences that were constantly swallowing, but he hadn't paid attention to the wondrous existences that were being spat out. At this moment, an extremely wondrous change occurred in his heaven, causing his mind, which was originally fused with the wondrous existences that were being swallowed, to suddenly be spat out of the heaven along with the wondrous existences that were being spat out. They entered the nothingness. At this moment, the haziness in his heaven became weaker and weaker. More and more of his mind was being spat out of the heaven, and it began to gather and merge into one. It grew stronger and stronger, allowing his mind to become clearer and clearer. Using this clarity, Luo Fan's main body turned to look at the place where the mind was located. When he looked, he found that his mind couldn't see it at all. He could only rely on the connection between the two minds and the fact that the mind belonged to him to determine the location of that mind. As for the specifics, he had no idea what the mind looked like and what form it was in. At this moment, all he could see was a stretch of nothingness. The mind that was growing stronger and stronger, and the wondrous existences that were being spat out from the heaven, did not exist in his eyes. Looks like I've accidentally come into contact with some sort of truth. At this moment, such a thought suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, he understood that after his mind underwent the transformation in the heaven over the past 300,000 years, it had undergone some sort of change that he couldn't understand. This change made his mind possess some sort of wondrous characteristic of the nothingness in the outside world. This wondrous characteristic made it so that even if Luo Fan could sense the existence of the mind, he couldn't see its shape or location. Compared to the wondrous existences that were devoured by the heaven, the wondrous existences that were spat out received a completely different treatment. After the wondrous existences that were devoured by the heaven entered the heaven, they were constantly divided and fused. At this moment, not only did the wondrous existences that were spat out not divide, but they were also constantly gathering. During the period of time that Luo Fan was secretly sensing, the whole body that his mind had gathered outside was already large enough to form his mind incarnation. With a thought, those consciousnesses began to condense, and they had already formed their consciousnesses. As it turned into a mind clone, The surroundings of the mind were completely imprinted into his senses and directly transmitted to where his main body was. Chapter 2995. In the eyes of his main body, the place where his consciousness clone was located was an expanse of nothingness. However, to his consciousness clone, it was not nothingness at all. Instead, it was a boundless ocean. There was no boundary, no surface, and no seabed. There was only a miraculous ocean that contained boundless seawater. At this moment, his consciousness clone had already fused with the ocean, and it had become a miraculous existence that was slightly different from the seawater around it. However, it was still a part of the seawater. At this moment, the surrounding seawater had seeped into his consciousness clone, causing his consciousness clone to seem to be ceaselessly devouring some extremely profound and miraculous existence at all times. It seemed to contain boundless information, boundless power, and countless indescribable laws were continuously seeping into his consciousness clone. During this process, his consciousness clone seemed to be faintly undergoing some sort of subtle change. It was as if it was gradually assimilating with the seawater around it, and it was about to gradually become part of the seawater around it. When he noticed this, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. His consciousness clone shook slightly, and then it had already become an independent entity, and it no longer absorbed any existences from the outside world. Obviously, it was extremely difficult for a living being to become an independent entity and no longer absorb anything from the outside world. After all, living beings had to breathe at all times, and they had to carry out all sorts of exchanges with the outside world. Regardless of whether it was the exchange of materials or information, it was the same. Under such circumstances, absorbing existences from the outside world could be said to be the instinct of living beings. It was clearly not easy to go against such an instinct. However, it was obvious that such an extremely difficult thing was not troublesome to Luo Fan at all. So long as a cultivator attained the connate grand heavenly realm, they would naturally be able to become an independent entity, and they would not seek external help. At that time, a cultivator would even be able to split open the heavens and earth, and they would be able to create everything they wanted. Although the time required would vary greatly, depending on the creation. How many times stronger was Luo Fan's current cultivation realm compared to ordinary connate grand heavenly realm cultivators? Even if it was Luo Fan himself, he would probably not be able to truly understand this without spending some time to carefully compare it. Under such circumstances, this sort of golden, immortal realm cultivation that was independent and didn't rely on anything else was naturally an instinct that was like breathing to him. No matter what it was, as long as he could attach his consciousness to it, even if he didn't have the slightest bit of strength, he could easily achieve this. Moreover, Luo Fan's current mental incarnation was not the kind of existence that did not have any power. The mind in this mind incarnation was Luo Fan's mind, and it had already fused with everything else about Luo Fan. It could be said that it contained power, space-time, might, divine abilities, worldview, and everything else. Although this kind of existence appeared to have no power at all, in reality, everything else was just hidden on the other side of the mind. As long as he wanted to, he could activate it at any time. Under such circumstances, how could it be difficult for the mind incarnation to be independent and not rely on external forces? It was the same even if it was facing the boundless ocean of nothingness that even his main body could not see through. At this moment, as Luo Fan's mind incarnation's connection with the outside world was cut off, all sorts of unbelievable pressure was generated out of thin air and continuously surged towards his mind incarnation. The pressure was so great that it was like a surging wave that covered the sky and the earth and penetrated through every pore. In just an instant, Luo Fan's mind incarnation began to emit ka-ka-ka-ka sounds. Countless cracks suddenly appeared from the inside to the outside. His entire mind incarnation seemed as if it was going to completely collapse in the next moment and completely perish. Obviously, if he didn't communicate with the outside world, he would be rejected by the boundless ocean of nothingness around him, and he would have to bear the terrifying pressure of the boundless ocean of nothingness around him. At this moment, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. His worldview instantly emerged from his mind incarnation, and it directly formed a strange world around the incarnation to meet the endless terrifying pressure. Boom, boom, boom. An earth-shattering commotion erupted in the sky. Under that terrifying pressure, it started to crack and collapse continuously, like a castle piled up with sand in the face of boundless waves. Facing such changes, Luo Fan breathed a sigh of relief. The world that was manifested from the worldview was naturally the world of laws. The world of laws could withstand the corrosion of the simulated chaotic state on his real body. It went without saying how strong its defensive ability was. Although the pressure transmitted by the surrounding seawater was terrifying, it was still just pressure. Even if the pressure was stronger and more terrifying than the simulated chaotic state, how terrifying could it be? The world of laws that could withstand the pressure of the simulated chaotic state couldn't possibly be useless against the ocean of nothingness no matter what. It was precisely because he thought of this that Luo Fan manifested the world of laws at this moment. At this moment, the world seemed to be collapsing from the pressure and was about to be destroyed. But at the very least, it had managed to resist the pressure. At least, at this time, his mind incarnation no longer felt the endless pressure around him attacking his body. With such a foundation, as long as he made certain adjustments and transformations to the world of laws to completely block the endless pressure around him, the possibility wasn't small. Under such circumstances, how could he not heave a sigh of relief? The ocean of nothingness seemed monotonous, but in fact, there were mysteries beyond imagination hidden within it. Even though it was just a natural pressure, it was still many times more terrifying than the pressure he had encountered in the seventh Great Tribulation, when the simulated state of chaos exerted on all living beings. In the simulated state of chaos, the world of laws manifested by the world of laws would definitely be able to easily protect itself. In fact, it would even absorb the simulated state of chaos and turn the world of laws into reality. But here, in this ocean, let alone absorbing the surrounding seawater to turn the world of laws into reality. Even withstanding that kind of pressure was extremely difficult for the laws of heaven and earth. According to the current speed of the world of laws collapse, it would take at most 2 to 4 hours for the world of laws to be completely crushed by the endless terrifying pressure around it. At that time, his mind incarnation would be able to use its own power to resist the endless and terrifying pressure. In the center of the world of laws, Luo Fan's mind incarnation frowned slightly. After the world of laws appeared, his body began to undergo all kinds of complicated and indescribable changes. The originally extremely pure mental characteristics began to gradually fade and were replaced by all kinds of complicated and indescribable characteristics emerging from his mind incarnation. Obviously, after the world of laws manifested and turned into the world of laws, everything that belonged to Luo Fan that was hidden behind the mind incarnation began to emerge involuntarily and gradually distort the mind incarnation, causing it to gradually change from a mind incarnation to a real incarnation. This kind of change had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that the real incarnation had more means to deal with the complicated and indescribable external environment. It was stronger, and its power was more incredible, making it easier to deal with. The disadvantage was that after becoming a real incarnation, the pureness and uniqueness of the mind was lost. At this time, the process of the incarnation absorbing the minds that converged into the ocean of nothingness from his heavens was completely interrupted. Now, the perception of the mind incarnation was getting weaker and weaker as it transformed into a real incarnation. At a certain moment, when the mind incarnation completely turned into a real incarnation, its perception of the mind incarnation was completely cut off. Apart from knowing that there were still minds constantly converging into the endless nothingness around him through his main body, He couldn't even discover the existence of those minds. And in contrast to this change, he discovered that the mysteries of the boundless ocean of nothingness seemed to have decreased a lot. The deep and unfathomable feeling that seemed to contain endless mysteries became fainter and fainter as the incarnation transformed. In the end, when his real incarnation was completely formed, the changes finally stopped. However, the ocean around him looked just like an ordinary ocean. With this change, the pressure that was constantly exerting on him also unknowingly weakened a lot. The process of the world of law's collapse had also completely stopped. With a single thought, everything that had collapsed and shattered was completely restored in just a few breaths. It was as if nothing had happened. Can only be sensed by the mind, or can only be sensed by certain existences that have gone through that cycle. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind, and a hint of hesitation appeared on his face. His mind wasn't special compared to his other parts, and the possibility that the endless ocean of nothingness around him treated his mind differently wasn't high. Therefore, no matter how he thought about it, it seemed that the second possibility was more likely to be true. At this moment, after the mysteries of the surrounding ocean of nothingness were greatly reduced, the pressure it exerted on Luo Fan's incarnation became insignificant. At this moment, with a thought, the world of laws around him that had recovered completely disappeared without a trace. The pressure surged and blasted on his incarnation, but it only caused his incarnation to tremble slightly, and it didn't suffer any damage. At a glance, the surroundings had already turned into a dead ocean. There was no longer any vitality, no vigor, and no mysteries to speak of. The stars that were originally dotted in the endless nothingness now looked like bubbles in this boundless ocean. Looking back, not far behind him, the heavens that belonged to him was also a bubble. It was an extremely huge and all-encompassing wonderful bubble that contained endless heaven and earth, infinite worlds, infinite space-time fragments, and half-planes. Although the mysteries have been greatly reduced, it's not useless. Seeing this scene, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Everything in front of him seemed to have greatly reduced the mysteries of the surrounding ocean of nothingness, but at least it was enough for him to look at the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road from a different perspective. Through this perspective, he could see the entire sixth level from another perspective, which gave him an additional reference to explore the essence of the sixth level. Therefore, he gave up on the idea of dispersing this incarnation. This incarnation immediately turned around and headed toward a huge bubble nearby. That bubble was extremely far away from this one, and from the perspective of this incarnation, it was probably billions of light years away. It was not an easy task to cross this distance, even for Luo Fan's incarnation. This was even more so when everything in this ocean was quite strange to him. Therefore, Luo Fan was prepared to spend tens of thousands of years to cross this distance. While this incarnation was hurrying to another bubble or another heavens, in another layer of the ocean of nothingness, in the layer of the ocean that could only be perceived by the mind that had experienced the cycle of heavens, Luo Fan's mind had once again gathered to the extent that it was enough to form a mind incarnation. Therefore, Luo Fan slightly moved his mind incarnation, and his mind incarnation was condensed once again. An incomparably profound ocean that contained endless mysteries was imprinted in the mind incarnation's eyes. This time, having learned his lesson, Luo Fan did not immediately control this mind incarnation to cut off the interaction with the surrounding seawater. Instead, he looked around in this state of constant interaction. At a glance, he saw that in another layer of the ocean, his real incarnation was moving at an extremely slow speed toward another heavens. Yes, it was moving at an extremely slow speed. Although in the perception of the real incarnation, it was moving at an extremely fast speed, leaving a distance of tens of thousands of light years behind in the blink of an eye. In the eyes of this mind incarnation, its speed was as slow as a snail. Genius 1 second to remember this website address. Mobile version. Chapter 2996. This change suddenly enlightened Luo Fan. Perhaps only by going deeper could he be less deceived by the surrounding nothingness. The shallower the level, the more deceived he would be. Obviously, the difference between the depth and the surrounding nothingness was the difference in the amount of communication with the surrounding nothingness. The more communication, the deeper the level. The less communication, the shallower the level. With this thought, Luo Fan knew that the level where his incarnation was, it might not be the deepest level of the nothingness ocean. On a deeper level, everything that he saw here was far from the truth. Is this the requirement? This thought came to Luo Fan's mind. The nothingness ocean had such a limit, which meant that if Luo Fan wanted to see more clearly, he needed to continue to exchange with the surrounding nothingness. Through this exchange, they could communicate with each other. Finally, this consciousness incarnation could dive deeper into the sea of nothingness and see the mysteries of the sea of nothingness. This was a choice. You had to take the risk and increase the exchange with the surrounding nothingness ocean, or avoid the risk as much as possible and let your perception of the surrounding nothingness ocean stop at a superficial level. In principle, the sixth level of the Tao Master's Path was created for cultivators to cultivate. The exchange between Luo Fan's mind incarnation and the inexplicable existence in the surrounding nothingness sea was carried out according to the fundamental rules of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. Therefore, the possibility of this exchange being harmful to Luo Fan was not great. However, the possibility was not high, but it did not mean it was impossible. A cultivator in charge obviously wouldn't take it for granted and treat it as impossible just because it wasn't likely. A cultivator needed to have the spirit to get to the bottom of everything in order to cultivate to a very high level. Only by being confused about the boundary between life and death could one transcend life and death and become an immortal or a god. Only by being confused about the boundary between yin and yang could one transcend yin and yang and become a Tai pure yang. Only by being confused about the boundary between inside and outside could one transcend the boundary between inside and outside and become an independent entity, and so on and so forth. Even if one wanted to become a true sage in the end, it was also because he was confused about tribulations, time, cause and effect, fate, and everything else. Only then could he finally transcend everything and have hope of becoming a true sage. If they didn't feel confused about the connection between life and death, and felt that it didn't matter whether they lived or died, why would living beings want to cultivate, want to live forever, and want to become immortals and gods? If he didn't even think about it, it was even more impossible for him to succeed. If he had not been confused by the boundary of yin and yang, and felt that he was already extremely perfect in the three realms of earth immortals, and that as long as he could live forever, nothing else mattered. His strength did not matter, his limitations did not matter, and yin and yang did not matter, then he would not have been able to achieve the pure Tai Yang. Therefore, for cultivators, the spirit of getting to the bottom of things was a very important spirit. For Luo Fan to be able to reach this step and become an existence at the peak of the seven tribulation, he was able to have his own, albeit incomplete, but extremely unique worldview. All of this was due to this spirit of pursuing the root of the matter. Because he was confused about the unique worldviews of many worlds, he finally sorted out his own worldview, and finally laid the most stable foundation for him to reach this step. It was because of his doubts about the existence of other realms that he now had a kind of immortality that was even more absolute than the concept of immortality, which was obtained by connecting many other realms. The other various categories were also due to similar reasons. Therefore, all along, Luo Fan had never given up the spirit of exploring everything and doubting everything. Even in the face of the power of a true sage, even in the face of all kinds of things related to a true sage, even in the face of the road to Tao Master, it was still the same. For him, unless it was really beyond his ability, and it was impossible for him to explore all kinds of things related to a true sage with his realm. Anything else, anything that he encountered, he had the intention to study it clearly and figure out the principles and mysteries behind it. This was the fundamental reason why he spent an unimaginably long amount of time on each of his fortuitous encounters. For other cultivators, the ultimate goal was to obtain opportunities in the places of opportunities. As long as they could obtain opportunities, they would be satisfied. As for the root of the places of opportunities, what kind of principles did they operate on, why they could provide such opportunities, and so on, they were not interested in the mysteries behind them. However, Luo Fan was obviously different. For Luo Fan, the opportunities given to him in any place of opportunities were secondary. Most importantly, the principles of the places of opportunities. Why was this land of opportunity a land of opportunity? Why was it able to give him so many benefits? What was the driving force behind these benefits? Could he recreate such places of opportunities? Could he strengthen these opportunities? And so on and so forth. It could be said that for Luo Fan, each place of opportunities was a key to open a whole new world and a whole new realm. In contrast, the opportunities contained in the places of opportunities were the most obvious benefits. At this moment, faced with the surrounding sea of nothingness, Luo Fan did not give up on the spirit of getting to the bottom of it. Even though the exchange between the mental incarnation and the surrounding sea of nothingness might not bring him any harm, Luo Fan still did not give up on the idea of finding out the truth. It was better to be safe than sorry. There was a high possibility that such an exchange would bring him benefits, but what if? If there were any disadvantages, he would not be able to bear it. Therefore, after Luo Fan confirmed that stopping the exchange would bring about consequences that he was unwilling to bear, he could only start to change his direction and carefully study the impact of the exchange on him. This exchange was extremely similar to the exchange between the heavens and the surrounding nothingness. Previously, he relied on the method of merging his mind with the existence of the heavens to see part of the truth of the surrounding sea of nothingness. In that case, what he should do now was actually very obvious. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. Relying on his absolute control over the mind incarnation, he once again separated a strand of his mind to lock onto the inexplicable existence that had poured into his mind incarnation out of thin air. As the inexplicable existence continued to divide, it also continued to divide. During this process, his mind seemed to have received some kind of strange combing, and it constantly integrated into his mental incarnation in a brand new state. As his mind integrated again, his mental incarnation seemed to have undergone some extremely subtle changes, and it gradually began to condense a similar existence that dispersed from his body and integrated into the surrounding endless sea of nothingness. Of course, this was only the final result. The process of the mind and the unknown existence entering his body and the new unknown existence dispersing and integrating into the surrounding sea of nothingness was unimaginably complicated. Even though all of this happened in Luo Fan's mental incarnation, which had almost absolute control over his body, Luo Fan still found it difficult to explain what exactly was going on. It was as if there was a fog in the middle of this process that concealed some of the changes, making it difficult for Luo Fan, the owner of this body, to truly see the truth of the changes. The changes are too detailed, and it's beyond the scope of my senses. Ultimately, Luo Fan's control over his body was not something that ordinary existences could compare to. At this moment, he could see the source of the fog at a glance. The reason why the fog was produced was obviously because the process was too complicated and too detailed. Almost every moment, there were trillions of tiny details producing terrifying changes that could be calculated by trillions of trillions, which made Luo Fan completely unable to grasp the specific changes, and he could only feel that the process was just a fog. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a thought, and he turned his head to look at the real incarnation that the mental incarnation had transformed into. At this moment, his incarnation suddenly sensed something new. What's this? At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation stopped and carefully looked in all directions. At this moment, he was already in a deep sea, and there was only seawater around him. There were no bubbles or the existence of any heavens nearby. Evidently, although the mental incarnation's flying speed was rather slow in the eyes of the mental incarnation, it had only arrived near Luo Fan's heavens. However, at this shallow layer, its speed was undoubtedly fast. At this moment, the location it had arrived at was clearly extremely far away from Luo Fan's heavens. At this moment, Luo Fan vaguely sensed that there seemed to be a peculiar existence in his surroundings that was different from other locations. That thing existed in the seawater, but it also seemed to be above the seawater, and it also seemed to be lower than the ocean that he had seen. Let me see where exactly it is. Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly, and he released his perception endlessly. As his perception surged, the surrounding seawater began to churn, and as the seawater churned, a behemoth gradually appeared in his perception. This was probably a behemoth that was at least several light years in size. It looked like a huge island floating in the boundless seawater. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation was shrouded in the shadow of this huge island. The moment Luo Fan's incarnation sensed the island instantly reacted to him. In just an instant, an unimaginably terrifying force directly acted on the incarnation, pushing it back several light years in an instant, directly arriving at the edge of the island. That's right, after being pushed back several light years, Luo Fan's incarnation had arrived at the edge of the island. The reason for this was very simple. It was because Luo Fan's incarnation had already entered the main body of the island. That shadow was actually the main body of the island. It was only because of the angle that it appeared to be a shadow. Previously, the shadow had clearly manifested rapidly and turned into reality in Luo Fan's perception, which produced that kind of force that pushed Luo Fan's incarnation out of the shadow, which was also the edge of the island. At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the edge of the island in front of him. I actually encountered a newcomer. How rare. Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and looked at the source of the voice. There was a small cave there. At this moment, a cultivator was standing at the entrance of the cave, looking at Luo Fan with an extremely curious gaze. It was a man who looked to be in his 30s. He had a dignified appearance and looked quite righteous. The aura he emitted was the aura of a normal six tribulation powerhouse. Occasionally, a subtle temperament flashed on his body, making it seem as if he had turned into a world of his own, a piece of space-time. Faintly, there were wisps of light that seemed to be alive flashing on his surface. A rogue cultivator? Luo Fan looked at the cultivator and asked. The cultivator was slightly taken aback, then laughed. It seems that fellow Taoist has just ascended. Only a rogue cultivator who has just ascended would care about the difference between a rogue cultivator and a Tao Master's disciple. However, fellow Taoist has guessed correctly. I am indeed a rogue cultivator. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly stunned. He knew in his heart that his previous guess about the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was probably very different from the truth. The situation of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was probably much more complicated than he had imagined. Although the cultivator said that he did not care about the difference between a Tao Master's disciple and a rogue cultivator, after confirming that Luo Fan was a rogue cultivator, his attitude towards Luo Fan involuntarily improved a lot. Originally, he only planned to say a few words to Luo Fan and warn him. At this time, he actually took the initiative to invite Luo Fan into his cave residence. The change in his attitude was almost visible to the naked eye. Luo Fan was extremely unfamiliar with the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, so he naturally would not refuse this cultivator's invitation. Immediately, he stepped into the cultivator's cave residence with a smile. Anyway, even if the other party had any plans, what he was here was just an incarnation. Even if it was destroyed, it would not be a loss for him. After conversation, they both exchanged names. The cultivator's name was Lu Tong, and he was indeed a rogue cultivator. However, in addition to his identity as a rogue cultivator, he also had another identity, and that was a prisoner. Genius 1 second remember this website address. Mobile version. Chapter 2997. That's right, Lu Tong was the prisoner of this island. This island seemed mysterious, but in fact, it was a prison. A prison that imprisoned many powerful cultivators and powerful existences like Lu Tong. At this moment, the place where Luo Fan and Lu Tong were located was not the main body of the prison. If one had to describe it, it should be equivalent to the window of the prison. At this time, this Lu Tong was obviously not his original body, but just an incarnation of his senses. In essence, it was like an incarnation of Luo Fan's mind. This is actually a prison? When he heard that the essence of this island was actually a prison, Luo Fan's brows couldn't help but wrinkle. It was beyond his expectations that there would be such a prison in the 6th level of the Dao Master's Road. After all, the Dao Master's Path originally had the Dao Master's Prison, a prison that could monitor and suppress all violations. Under such circumstances, there was actually someone who set up such a prison. It was as if there was a private person who set up his own prison in a country. This was completely a direct provocation of the country, and here, it was directly challenging the Dao Master's Road. It was hard to imagine how powerful an existence who dared to do such a thing and was able to do such a thing would have to be able to do so. It's a prison. Now that you have appeared here, I think you must have been targeted by the prison. Next, I'm afraid that you have to be prepared to be suppressed by the prison. Lu Tong sighed and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan just shook his head lightly and said, This prison has targeted me? Impossible. I don't think I have violated anyone's taboo, let alone the Dao Master's Road. How could this prison have targeted me? Lu Tong smiled bitterly and said, It was the same for me. I didn't do anything, but suddenly came across this prison and was directly suppressed. In the end, it took me tens of billions of years to find this window. With difficulty, I probe a little bit of my perception, but I could only wander around the edge of this window, unable to really escape. Luo Fan frowned. So you're saying that as long as I run into this prison, I will definitely be suppressed. That's right. Over the past tens of billions of years, I've seen dozens of fellow Taoists who also didn't do anything. All they did was appear at the border of the prison and were immediately suppressed by the prison. So, fellow Taoist has invited me here to make things more convenient for the prison and to perform meritorious deed for the prison in order to reduce my sentence. Luo Fan suddenly asked indifferently. Upon hearing this, Lu Tong just shook her head and said, Of course not. There is no such thing as commuting a sentence in prison. What was the point of contributing to the prison? Rest assured, fellow Taoist, I invited fellow Taoist here just to see if the method I've been researching over the years works. In any case, fellow Taoist, this isn't much of a loss, is it? A method of research? Could it be that fellow Taoist is referring to the fact that the prison will think that we are already in prison and have been suppressed here? Luo Fan asked. These words caused Lu Tong to be slightly stunned. He didn't expect that Luo Fan would actually see through the conclusion that he had come to after studying for tens of billions of years at a glance. After a long time, he sighed and said, Sure enough, every time I meet a genius, I always feel a deep sense of defeat. Geniuses really aren't something that ordinary people like us can compare with. Upon hearing this, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He looked at Lu Tong as if he was looking at an actor. Which cultivator who could step into the 6th level of the road to Dao Master was not a genius? Which one of them was not a genius who was superior to billions of lives? For such an existence to say that he was an ordinary person, it was too fake of an act. As for the so-called possibility that he had researched for tens of billions of years, it was not a problem at all. In the eyes of Luo Fan, this possibility could not be more obvious. This so-called window was obviously completely different from the window of an ordinary prison. Although it was said to be a window, in essence there was absolutely no connection between time and space with the prison cell. At most, there would only be some kind of subtle connection between karma, allowing the experts in the prison to use the karma connection to probe out some kind of perception. With the help of this karma connection, they would be able to detect all sorts of things outside the prison. Under such circumstances, in the eyes of the prison, the location of the window was naturally a part of the prison. After all, The existence of the cause and effect connection had already tightly connected the window to the prison cell, making it a part of the prison cell. And here, Lutong could rely on this window to turn his perception into an incarnation and stay here for tens of billions of years. This also showed that this window was obviously a way for the prison to acknowledge that it could communicate with the outside world, or this was a place that the prison could not detect. With all these circumstances, it was obviously not surprising that Luo Fan could guess the method that Lutong had researched. Of course, Luo Fan would not agree with what Lutong had said. You said it was a prison, so this was a prison? You said it was a window, so this was a window? If he really trusted others so easily, he would have long died hundreds of millions of years ago. At this time, although Lutong made a solemn vow, he obviously would not believe anything he said before he could clearly sense it. With a slight thought, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already stepped out of the cave. The moment he stepped out of the cave mansion, there was a subtle, binding force acting on his body. This binding force was not strong, but for an ordinary sixth tribulation expert, it was a terrifying force that was enough to completely bind them. When he saw that Luo Fan had actually stepped out of the cave mansion so easily, Lutong could not help but change his expression slightly, and an indescribable surprise burst out from his eyes. Although the binding force of this window on cultivators was not strong, at least compared to the prison cell, the binding force could only be regarded as ordinary. However, even such a restrictive force was enough to bind a sixth tribulation powerhouse tightly. It was precisely because of the existence of this binding force that his perception incarnation could not truly leave this cave mansion, this window, and this prison. Otherwise, he would have left this place long ago. Why would he have the mood to stay here and spend tens of billions of years studying the binding laws of this prison? However, at this moment, what he saw was that this newly ascended rogue cultivator, a fellow cultivator that he had a good impression of, a fellow cultivator that he could trust, had easily broken free from this binding force and freely left this prison that he had been unable to break out of for tens of billions of years. How could he not be aghast? After the shock, he was filled with boundless joy. If the other party could so easily break free from this binding force, then it would obviously not be a problem for him to bring him away. Furthermore, there seemed to be hope for him to bring his main body out of this prison. In other words, at this time, in Lutong's eyes, Luo Fan represented a hope to escape this prison and get rid of the tens of billions of years of suppression. How could he not be surprised? As for the estrangement that he had created between them when he schemed against Luo Fan, this was even less of a problem. He believed that with his knowledge, with Luo Fan's identity as a newly ascended cultivator, and with his unfamiliarity with the sixth level, he would definitely be able to find a price that would allow Luo Fan to take the initiative to eliminate this estrangement. Fellow cultivator, please wait, please wait. Lutong shouted at this time, wanting Luo Fan to come back and communicate with him again to eliminate the estrangement that had been created previously. However, at this time, in the face of such words, Luo Fan did not even have the desire to look back. He just flew up, and in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the front of the island. Seeing that Luo Fan had left without looking back, Lutong finally became anxious. I have the information that fellow cultivator needs here. Don't miss this opportunity because of a moment of anger. Lutong shouted, but Luo Fan did not pay any attention to him. At this time, what he wanted more was to find out the truth about this so-called prison. That is, the truth about this island through his own probe. As for the other things, including the various things about the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, the various things about the prison, the various things about the inside of the prison, and everything that Lutong knew, he was not in a hurry. After all, Lutong was completely suppressed by this prison. No matter what, he could only stay there. When he wanted to listen to Lutong's words, he could just go to him. All the initiative was in his hands, so why should he listen to Lutong's arrangements? The surface of the prison looked like an island, an extremely large island with an area calculated in light years. On this island, time and space were formed, completely isolated from the endless void ocean outside, as if there was an invisible barrier that completely separated the void ocean from the inside of the island. In front of this island, there was an extremely vast continent. On it, there were all kinds of things that a normal continent would have, such as mountains, rivers, grasslands, deserts, forests, swamps, plains, plateaus, Gobi Desert, deep valleys, and so on. There were all kinds of things, as if it was a complete world. On top of that, there were countless living beings living on it. These creatures on the island seemed to be in a normal world, extremely free and normal. Just by looking at this island, Luo Fan could not feel that it was a prison at all. Of course, he did not think that Lu Tong was lying because of this. After all, this kind of lie was too easy to expose. Even ordinary people could not tell such a lie, let alone Lu Tong, who was already a sixth tribulation expert. Since he dared to say that this was a prison, then there must be a secret here that he could not see at a glance. This kind of secret was what turned this island into a prison. That was why it could completely imprison an existence like Lu Tong here. Although Lu Tong was already an expert at the peak of the seven tribulation, he was definitely above all the ordinary cultivators on the sixth floor of the Tao Master's path. However, Luo Fan did not become arrogant because of this. At this moment, when he saw this seemingly normal island, he didn't pounce on it carelessly just because of what he saw. After all, the sixth floor of the Tao Master's path was opened up by many Tao Masters. Such an existence, in essence, was absolutely much higher than any cultivator below the Tao Master, or even below the true sage. Therefore, in this Tao Master's path, unless one was a true sage, otherwise, even if one was a nine-tribulation expert, it was likely that one would suffer a great loss on the first floor of the Tao Master's path and be directly suppressed or even obliterated by the Tao Master's path. What's more, at this time, Luo Fan was only at the peak of the seven tribulation expert, and this was not the first floor of the Tao Master's path, but the sixth floor. In such a place, there were too many things that could threaten Luo Fan. In this way, how could he not be vigilant in the face of a completely unfamiliar thing, and a cultivator who seemed to have warned him about it? How could he just jump on it? At this moment, his perception slowly enveloped the island below. Although the area of this island needed to be calculated in light years, compared to Luo Fan's perception, this range was only a very narrow one. He didn't even need to exert much strength in his perception to easily cover the entire island. Under the infiltration of his perception, all kinds of things on this island began to slowly flow into his heart. Sure enough, it was just as he had guessed. His perception did not detect anything unusual. It was like the most ordinary of islands. Although it was an island floating in the boundless void sea, in his perception, the living beings on the island were like living beings born in the normal world. Everything on this island that he sensed was also like everything in the normal world. Under his perception, everything seemed so ordinary, so ordinary. This result made Luo Fan even more vigilant. An island floating in the void actually seemed ordinary and normal, as if it was an ordinary world. No matter how one looked at it, it was extremely strange. From Luo Fan's experience, there was only one possibility for this to happen, and that was that the hidden secret of this island was beyond the scope of his perception. This was the only reason why his senses were unable to sense anything unusual at this moment. Only then would he treat this island as an ordinary world. Genius 1, second, remember this website address. Mobile version. Chapter 2998. Luo Fan was a little surprised by this situation, but he also felt that it was reasonable. After all, according to Lu Tong, this was a prison that could imprison an unimaginable number of six tribulation powerhouses. It would be strange if he could see through all the secrets of such a prison at a glance. Even if he was already at the peak of the seven tribulation, it was still the same. Not being able to perceive the secrets did not mean that there were no secrets. It only meant that the secrets were beyond his imagination. With a slight thought, Luo Fan separated a trace of his projection and landed on the island. This projection was not extremely weak, but it was not powerful either. Looking at its overall strength, it was at most equivalent to an ordinary expert in the tribulation realm. This kind of strength was enough to shake the world. However, in the 6th level of the Town Master's Road, such an existence could be completely erased by any cultivator with a single thought. Of course, such strength was already an absolute expert to the many creatures on this island that Luo Fan could sense. If this projection did not cause any changes when it landed on the island, it was enough to completely control everything on this island. Of course, Luo Fan understood in his heart that changes would inevitably occur. It was impossible for his projection to completely control everything on this island. Even if it wasn't a prison, for it to exist in this void ocean, this island was definitely not simple. It was definitely not something that an ordinary 6th tribulation expert could control. What's more, Luo Fan's projection was only equivalent to an expert in the tribulation realm. Moreover, even if all these things did not exist, and this was just a simple, ordinary island without any other mysteries, it would have long been controlled by other 6th tribulation experts. How could it wait for Luo Fan's projection to control everything? Just as the projection entered the range of the island, which was the boundary between the island and the boundless ocean outside, a figure suddenly appeared. Suddenly, an unimaginable shackle appeared on Luo Fan's projection out of thin air. His projection was abruptly pulled and turned into a meteor, crashing straight towards the ground of the island below. At this moment, Luo Fan also felt that his clone had also felt some inexplicable shackles appearing all over his body. The shackles began to shrink and press down on his body. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan's face showed an inexplicable expression, and he thought to himself, as expected. In that instant, he had a thought, and he ruthlessly severed the connection between his avatar and his projection. This kind of cutting power was unimaginably strong. It could be said that all traces of the projection's existence, even the memories in the hearts of all living beings, were cut off. With this kind of cutting power, not to mention a mere projection, even if the connection was 1,000 times closer, it would still be completely severed in an instant. It was precisely because Luo Fan's cultivation had reached the peak of the 7th tribulation that he was able to do this. That was why he was able to cut off the connection so quickly and decisively. If he wasn't so powerful, if he wasn't so decisive, he definitely wouldn't have been able to sever the connection before the shackle completely suppressed his clone. And once he was truly suppressed by the shackle, his projection's fate would be the same as his clone's. Rumble. At this moment, even though there was a mysterious barrier between them, a loud rumble still rang out. In just an instant, the entire island below began to shake violently. An indescribable shock wave spread out in all directions from where the projection fell. In just the blink of an eye, it had already swept through the entire surface of the island and even reached deep into the depths of the island. Clearly, this shock wave was the source of the island's tremors. This shock wave swept through the entire island, but it didn't affect the various topography and living beings on the surface of the island at all. When the shock wave swept across the entire island, all the living creatures seemed to exist independently of the island, completely ignoring the shock wave. No matter how the shock wave swept past them, there was not the slightest bit of abnormality. In just an instant, Luo Fan knew that most of what Latong said before was probably true. The island in front of him was probably really a prison, an absolute prison for a 6th tribulation powerhouse. After the connection between the projection and the clone was severed by Luo Fan, it had already become completely independent. However, after this independence, the intelligence and thoughts that Luo Fan had given to the projection had also completely disappeared without a trace. Now the projection was just like a body. All that was left was his body's instincts and his own spirituality. Luo Fan's consciousness, will, and memories didn't exist in the slightest. At this moment, under the endless shackles, the projection looked like an ordinary statue. At this moment, the sculpture's body had sunk into the ground. Its expression was extremely dull, and its eyes were inexplicably empty. There wasn't a trace of vitality in its body, and it was no different from a dead object. Even if it was just a projection, the thing that Luo Fan constructed was definitely not something that an ordinary existence could compare to. Although the projection was called a projection, it was actually not much different from a real body of flesh and blood. It wasn't in the illusory state of an ordinary projection. Moreover, the power and might of a tribulation cultivator contained in it were also real and genuine. At this moment, the power and might had been directly imprisoned in the projection's body by the incredible shackles. Without the control of Luo Fan's will, the power and might could only follow the instincts of the body and circulate continuously. Under the circulation of this power, Luo Fan's projected body gradually began to change. From its original appearance, it gradually broke apart, turning into various space-time, various worlds, various heavens and earth. These space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth were densely packed, but each of them looked extremely broken and imperfect. Within that space-time, one could clearly sense that there were endless changes brewing within. Countless broken laws, powers, time, space, and even more mysterious things were all trying their best to influence, resist, and combine with each other, as if they wanted to rebuild a complete world, and space-time. Of course, because of the existence of the shackles, these existences maintained a humanoid form. At first glance, they still looked like humanoid creatures. At this moment, an indescribable suction force was generated from the shackles. This suction force acted on the world, and space-time above Luo Fan's projection, continuously absorbing all kinds of mysterious existences from them. Under this absorption, the endless existences began to quickly wither. This kind of absorption was obviously related to the shackles. If it couldn't get rid of the shackles, it naturally couldn't get rid of the absorption. Therefore, at this moment, even though Luo Fan hated this kind of absorption, he could only watch helplessly as this suction force continuously sucked away everything in the world, space, and time in his body. As the absorption continued, the body of Luo Fan's projection had completely collapsed and disappeared in just 3 days, as if it had never existed. Destroyed. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone was a little surprised. At this moment, the projection had already completely disappeared. This was obviously very different from what Latong had said. To completely destroy and erase all living beings that entered like this was not something that a normal prison should do. So, the island in front of him was actually not a prison, but a killing field. With a thought, he suddenly felt that there seemed to be some kind of existence escaping from the projection and fusing with the island through some indescribable and complicated method. That was the vague will that had just been born from the projection. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan already understood what was going on. He continued to watch, and not long after, in another strange place on the island, a creature with a vague will was born. This creature looked no different from any other creature on the island, and there was not much difference at all. Ha, you fell for it. As soon as this creature was born, a voice came from below. Then a groundhog drilled out of the ground below, looking at the strange bird creature with an extremely human-like expression, and said such words. As expected, the bodies of all the creatures have been destroyed, leaving only a little consciousness to reincarnate into ordinary creatures here. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan finally confirmed his previous thoughts. The bird that was born at this time was actually a creature that was reincarnated from the vague consciousness that had just been born from Luo Fan's projection. This creature actually had nothing to do with Luo Fan anymore. It did not come from Luo Fan's will, nor did it come from his mind. It was purely a brand new will that was naturally derived from the body of the projection that he had constructed. Moreover, it was not a complete will, and it was only a blurry will that was like a piece of white paper. If this will could stay in Luo Fan's projection for a little longer and absorb enough nutrients, memories, and inheritances from his projection, this would naturally be able to form a relationship with Luo Fan, and to a certain extent, it could even become his bloodline descendant. However, evidently, this did not happen. As soon as this will was born, Luo Fan's projection was completely destroyed by the shackles, and there was nothing left. Under such circumstances, this will could only be regarded as an empty will. The relationship between it and Luo Fan was obviously so estranged that it was almost non-existent. In the face of the groundhog's words, this new creature only looked at it curiously, and it did not do anything, let alone respond. The groundhog faltered slightly and said a few more words. After discovering that the avian creature didn't move at all, nor did it respond with any words, it suddenly understood what was going on. It couldn't help but look up at Luo Fan with a complicated expression. Its gaze was filled with astonishment, admiration, fear, and an indescribable sense of regret. It was astonished and in admiration that Luo Fan was able to sever the connection between his projection and himself so thoroughly. Normally speaking, even if the connection between his projection and his true body was completely severed, it would only grant the projection freedom. However, there was no way that it could completely destroy all of the projection sentience. At the very least, this cultivator had never seen a cultivator do this in the long years that he had lived. Under such circumstances, he naturally had to feel astonished and impressed by Luo Fan's means. In contrast to the astonishment and admiration, there was, of course, fear and regret. No one knew how far a powerful existence with such means could go in this prison. Perhaps he could easily break through the shackles of this prison and become a tyrant. He was clearly teasing Lin Fan before, and if Lin Fan was a little narrow-minded, he could not imagine what would happen to him. With such worries, how could he not feel fear? And how could he not feel regret for teasing Lin Fan before? Normally speaking, a cultivator who could cultivate to this stage and reach the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road should not be so narrow-minded and react so strongly to his teasing. However, what if? There were very few cultivators who were so narrow-minded, which meant that such narrow-minded cultivators could still appear. It was naturally a good thing that Luo Fan was in the majority. If he wasn't, wouldn't it be difficult for him to make decisions about his own life? With such a risk, any 6 tribulation powerhouse would obviously not ignore it. The groundhog's expression kept changing, and the bird above seemed to have already come to a conclusion. It flapped its wings and directly leaped down from the nest, landing directly on the head of the groundhog. It gently pecked the groundhog and said, "Hungry, hungry, hungry." It was obvious that the bird was starving at this moment and urgently needed nourishment. At this moment, the groundhog appeared, and it directly regarded it as its nurturer. Chapter 2999. Even though this bird had only just been born, its origin was quite extraordinary. After all, even though it had only just been born, it was already extremely powerful. Even though it didn't possess any extraordinary abilities, its peck was still enough to sever jade and shred gold. However, the groundhog was clearly quite extraordinary as well. The bird's origin was only a projection of a tribulation stage powerful being like Luo Fan, while the groundhog's origin was a 6th tribulation stage powerful being. This massive disparity in their origins meant that there was a substantial disparity between the two of them. Although this difference in nature wasn't obvious in this prison's host creature, it still existed in the end. Thus, this powerful peck merely caused the groundhog's head to resound, and it merely left a white mark on its head. Apart from that, it didn't do anything else to the groundhog. A thought suddenly flashed through the groundhog's mind, and it knew what it had to do after hearing the bird's cries of hunger in its head. "Hungry? That's great. I just so happen to have some food. Please come with me, fellow Taoist." The groundhog immediately smiled, and its expression was brimming with enthusiasm. Thus, it leaped out of the ground and began to rush through the forest with the bird in tow. As a being that had lived in this prison for tens of billions of years, it was extremely familiar with everything in this forest, and it was even more familiar with the species of birds. Under such circumstances, he naturally knew exactly where to find the food that the bird loved the most. Only then could this bird-like creature obtain the greatest satisfaction. That's right, this was the method that it had thought of to prevent Luo Fan from finding trouble with it. The bird didn't have the ability to survive on its own, so if it was left alone, it wouldn't be able to inflict much damage to its consciousness. Even though its consciousness was completely blank, it was still far superior to the consciousness of a normal bird. One death wouldn't actually have much effect on its consciousness. Under the laws of this prison, it would at most reincarnate. However, it was quite clear that the bird's physical body would most definitely die. The death of its physical body would still make the bird's consciousness feel very uncomfortable. Therefore, if there was a living being that could help the bird survive, it would obviously reduce the pain of the bird's consciousness. This was not a huge favor, but at the very least, it was enough for the bird's consciousness to feel the living being's kindness. This kind of kindness was more than enough to make up for the ridicule he had given to that expert earlier. This was the solution that he had thought of in a flash of inspiration. Luo Fan smiled faintly at the sight of the groundhog enthusiastically taking care of the bird that had been formed from its projection. He naturally knew what the groundhog was thinking. However, he could only say that he was thinking too much. Luo Fan was not one of the few. His temperament was not narrow-minded to that extent. He didn't take the groundhog's ridicule to heart at all. Even if the other party didn't take any action, he wouldn't plot against him just because of this teasing. Of course, he had no intention of explaining the misunderstanding to the groundhog. No matter what, the other party's misunderstanding was actually beneficial to him. At the very least, he wouldn't have to watch as the bird that was like a piece of white paper died, because it no longer had the ability to survive. This island, or rather, the layer of nothingness where the prison was located, was not the extremely shallow layer that his clone had been in before. Instead, it was on a deeper level compared to the shallow layer that treated the sea of nothingness as an ordinary ocean. Although it was far inferior to the layer that the consciousness clone was in, the process of the clone being repelled by the shadow of the prison was actually the same as the prison pulling it from the surface layer to the deeper layer. It was precisely because the two of them were on different layers in the beginning that they didn't interfere with each other. Luo Fan's clone could even directly enter the main body of the prison without any obstruction. It was also because the two of them were pulled into the same layer after that the characteristic of not interfering with each other disappeared. Only this prison was able to obstruct and restrain him. From a certain perspective, it was actually an extremely simple matter to break out of this prison. That was to dive into the deeper layer of nothingness than the prison. The prison itself could pull cultivators from the shallower layer to the deeper layer, but it was clearly impossible to pull cultivators from the deeper layer into the shallower layer. For example, a person could lift an object that was smaller than their strength limit, but they definitely couldn't lift an object that exceeded their strength limit. At this moment, in the nothingness ocean, the difference between the shallower layer and the deeper layer was like the difference in weight. The deeper layer was equivalent to the higher the strength limit. The shallower layer was equivalent to the lower the strength limit. Clearly, it was not difficult for the deeper layer to pull the shallower layer into the deeper layer. However, on the other hand, if the shallower layer wanted to pull the deeper layer out, it would be equivalent to a person overestimating their strength and trying to lift an object that exceeded their strength limit. It went without saying how difficult it would be. Of course, this was only an analogy. Compared to lifting an ordinary heavy object, the situation inside the nothingness ocean was clearly much more complicated. The difference between the deeper layer and the shallower layer wasn't just the difference in weight. The real difference was the difference between dimensions. Without some special ability, objects from different layers simply couldn't come into contact with objects from other layers. It was just like words on 2 pages of a book. Normally, it was impossible for them to interfere with each other. Unless the words were protruding, then they could affect other layers through imprints or something. Evidently, this prison possessed a special ability that could affect the other layers of the ancient god realm. The prison clearly relied on this ability to pull Luo Fan, who was on the shallower layer, directly into the nothingness ocean layer where the prison was located. Moreover, it could only pull shallower objects into its layer. After all, to pull something into that layer, there had to be 2 conditions. First, it had to be able to see and catch it. Second, it had to be able to pull it. Clearly, only shallower objects could meet these 2 conditions. Something deeper could only meet the condition of being able to be caught at most. Compared to Luo Fan's original incarnation, this prison was in a deeper layer. However, compared to Luo Fan's incarnation, this prison was actually a shallower layer. As long as a deeper existence was aware of the existence of a certain shallower layer, it would naturally be able to clearly see everything in that shallower layer from an overlooking position. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation focused his gaze on the layer where the prison was located. As he focused his gaze on that layer, a world that was many times more prosperous than he had imagined appeared in his senses. The layer where the prison was located was completely different from the other layers. At least, it was completely different from the other layers of the nothingness ocean that Luo Fan had encountered before. The other layers of the nothingness ocean were empty, as if the endless nothingness in the heavens had been replaced by endless seawater. However, the situation was completely different on the layer where the prison was located. There were hundreds of millions of prison-like islands densely packed here. These islands were of various sizes. Some were ordinary, some were strange, some were mysterious, some were profound, and some were even illusory. Almost all the islands that could possibly exist were displayed in the various categories. These islands existed in the nothingness ocean layer in various ways. Some roamed freely in the ocean layer, some were fixed in a certain position. Some simply flashed continuously, as if they were constantly shifting between the faults of time and space. Some were even attached to other islands or hidden in the shadows of the islands. On the Boundless Island, this prison didn't seem all that special. On the contrary, it looked extremely ordinary. Compared to this prison, among the many islands, there were countless islands that looked more like prisons. This is the main activity layer for many cultivators. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. Obviously, this layer of the nothingness ocean seemed to be a little special compared to the other layers of the nothingness ocean, allowing many cultivators to step into it and communicate with each other. At this moment, there were countless cultivators coming and going between the many islands. This made the nothingness ocean layer seem even more lively. Of course, there was no doubt that the nothingness ocean layer was vast. As the nothingness ocean layer, its size was naturally comparable to the entire sixth layer of the Tao Master's Path. The sixth layer of the Tao Master's Path could accommodate hundreds of millions of heavens in an extremely sparse manner. There were many islands and cultivators in this place. Even though this place was much livelier than the other layers of the Void Ocean, it was still extremely sparse and spacious. It could be said that if one did not know the existence of an island and the route to that island, the chances of encountering a specific island by chance were extremely slim. Take this prison, for example. For tens of billions of years, only a few dozen cultivators had accidentally encountered it and been suppressed. It could be said that an unlucky person would only appear once in hundreds of millions of years. This was enough to show how sparse the distribution of the cultivators on the many islands was. At this moment, Luo Fan focused his attention on the prison. This prison had already piqued his interest. As for the mysteries of this prison and the existence behind it, he really wanted to get to the bottom of it. Looks like it's time for me to help. At this moment, Luo Fan's mind incarnation thought. With this thought, a stream of consciousness began to pass from the mind incarnation to the mind incarnation. Although the mind incarnation and the mind incarnation were in two different layers of the nothingness ocean. However, no matter what, it was still an existence derived from Luo Fan's main body. With this specific and detailed connection, the two could naturally communicate with each other. At this moment, this stream of consciousness was passed to the real body incarnation. In an instant, the incarnation felt that his perspective began to rapidly rise. In the blink of an eye, it had already risen to an unimaginable height. He looked down at the originally mysterious and obscure prison in an indescribable way. Through this perspective, he finally saw some clues about the prison. It really is a prison, and it's a prison formed by a cultivator's projection of the heavens. There can actually be such changes, and there can actually be such a cultivation method. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart was filled with shock. At this moment, he saw a trace of the hidden secrets inside the prison through the mind incarnation's transmission of consciousness. This prison looked like an ordinary island, but in fact, it contained endless heaven and earth, endless worlds, endless space-time fragments, half-planes. However, everything seemed illusory at the same time. It looked like a real heaven and earth, a real world, a real space-time fragment, and a real half-plane. However, as long as one took a closer look, they would discover that all of this only looked real, but in essence, they seemed to be illusory. It was just an existence similar to an illusion. This appearance of the heavens was obviously very similar to a projection. Therefore, Luo Fan guessed that this heavens was a projection of the real heavens. These projections were not arranged according to the structure of the normal heavens. The various heaven and earth, worlds, space-time fragments, and half-planes in the projection of the heavens were built together in a way that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with, and finally formed this island. It also formed all sorts of incredible laws that the island itself possessed. Although such an existence could not compare to the real heavens, it was not much different from the real heavens in comparison. Based on the characteristics of the heavens, this island could also be regarded as a projection of the light of heaven and earth from a certain special angle. Such an existence was obviously not something that an ordinary six tribulation powerhouse could compare to. It was actually extremely normal for those six tribulation powerhouses to be imprisoned here and not be able to transcend. Of course, at this moment, Luo Fan suspected that the six tribulation powerhouses imprisoned here might not be the true bodies of those six tribulation powerhouses, but something similar to clones or incarnations. Chapter 3000. The reason why he made such a judgment was very simple. It was because Luo Fan was able to sense some auras that had an inexplicable connection with the cultivators in this prison from the many islands in this layer of the void ocean layer. This kind of feeling was not the Avatar's own feeling, but it came from the consciousness of the Avatar in the deeper layer. The deeper he went, the more things he could sense. If this true Avatar wanted to sense the auras on the other islands in this layer, it could only sense the auras of the islands as a whole at most. If he wanted to distinguish the auras of the living beings on the islands, it would only be possible for the Avatar to distinguish the auras of the living beings on the islands. Only by relying on the overlooking quality that came from a deeper layer of the mind could one bypass the restrictions of this layer of nothingness. Only by relying on the consciousness that came from the deeper layer would he be able to complete this seemingly impossible achievement. The auras of the living beings on those islands clearly meant that there were very likely to be avatars, clones, or projections of these living beings on those islands. Since there were such existences on those islands, it was very likely that the living beings on this island were clones and incarnations of those existences. Knowing that these living beings might only be avatars and avatars, Luo Fan had a better understanding of this prison in front of him. First of all, the range of influence of this prison was limited. The distance between the two islands had clearly exceeded the range of influence of this prison. Just like before, when Luo Fan's projection was imprisoned in this prison, his true body was also affected. If he had not made a prompt decision to completely cut off the connection between his projection and his avatar would have been imprisoned by this island. As for the other cultivators, their avatars and avatars were also in this layer of nothingness, but their avatars and avatars in this prison had been suppressed, while their avatars and avatars on other islands were not affected at all. This was most likely because of the distance. Because the distance between Luo Fan's avatar and the prison was much closer than the avatars and avatars of other cultivators, his avatar was affected by the projection, while the avatars and avatars of other living beings weren't affected by the avatars and avatars of other living beings. Secondly, this prison might be able to completely imprison the connection between the avatars and the main body. Otherwise, it was really inexplicable why these avatars and avatars were imprisoned on this island like prisoners, and the cultivators' main bodies did not react at all. if it were Luo Fan himself, even if a trace of his projection was imprisoned, he would do everything he could to free it. After all, this was not only about the existence of his projection or avatar, but it was also about his own cultivation, his own privacy, and even his own Tao. It could be said that even if a trace of his projection was imprisoned, it would be equivalent to opening a loophole in his own body. This was not something that Luo Fan could tolerate. Any cultivator would absolutely not be able to tolerate it. Therefore, if they knew where their avatars, or even projections were imprisoned, they would definitely think of ways to come to this prison and rescue their avatars, or projections. However, what was the situation in this prison at this time? For tens of billions of years, not a single cultivator's main body or other avatars had come here. Not a single cultivator tried to rescue their avatars, or projections. This situation was clearly enough to show that this prison clearly had the ability to completely cut off the connection between the imprisoned existence and their main body or other avatars, or projections. Only by completely cutting off this connection, the avatars, and projections would not be able to find this prison at all, and only then would the imprisoned avatars, and projections be completely given up. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's face suddenly trembled. At this moment, he felt many gazes fall on him. These gazes were extremely obscure. If he did not have the reinforcement of his mind from a deeper level, he would not have been able to discover the existence of these gazes. With a thought, he traced the gazes into the distance, and very soon found the source of these gazes. Those gazes had clearly come from the prison. They came from those seemingly ordinary living beings. They don't seem to have completely lost their extraordinary powers. Luo Fan looked at those living beings and suddenly had a realization. From the outside, these living beings looked like completely ordinary living beings without any extraordinary powers. Previously, Luo Fan had determined that they did not have extraordinary powers at all, and that all of their extraordinary powers had been completely imprisoned by the prison. However, now it seemed that perhaps his previous thoughts were a little too absolute. Perhaps most of the creature's supernatural powers had been sealed, but there were still a few who, through various methods, managed to hold on to their powers with great difficulty when they were sealed, or came up with a new way to regain their powers after they were sealed. Either way, they still had some supernatural powers at the moment. These extraordinary powers were not enough for them to break free from the prison, but they were enough for them to do many things that normal living beings could not do. For example, using a special method to investigate Luo Fan was one of these things. With that in mind, Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly, and the many gazes that were spying on him were instantly severed. In just an instant, countless living beings on the island let out blood-curdling screams. The agonized cries abruptly stopped, and the living beings that were letting loose agonized cries all became cautious, as if they had heard the agonized cries of other living beings. Right at this moment, in a certain forest down below, the bird that was happily eating the insects brought by the groundhog suddenly shuddered, and its perplexed eyes suddenly focused as an extremely profound light appeared within them. "So that's what it feels like," it murmured. The groundhog faltered slightly upon hearing this before its expression changed drastically, and it abruptly stood up as it looked at the bird with an extremely grave expression. "Who are you? Do you know what kind of enemies you'll provoke if you try to possess it?" All of the fur on the groundhog's body had already stood up on end, and it looked like an enraged hedgehog. The bird smiled faintly upon hearing this, and it shook off all of the dust on its body. Its entire body became extremely clean in the blink of an eye, as if it had never come into contact with any filth or dust since its birth. The groundhog's expression became even more solemn when it saw this. Its vast knowledge and experience allowed it to clearly understand what the bird's actions entailed. The bird's tremble just now did not contain any transcendent power at all. All of the power it had used was the power of its flesh and blood. With the power of one's flesh and blood, one could skillfully shake off the dust on one's body so that there was not a single speck of dust left on one's body. Even the sticky tree sap that was deeply entangled with one's feathers could be completely shaken off. This technique of using one's power was definitely not something that ordinary living beings could do. Furthermore, the fact that it had managed to do this right at the beginning of its possession was a clear indication of just how powerful this being was. Now that such a powerful being was standing right before it, how could it not be concerned? "Don't worry, it's me," the bird replied in an indifferent voice. As it spoke, its body began to squirm slightly, and the blood within its body began to swell at a rate that was discernible to the naked eye. Within the span of a few breaths, its body had swelled to twice its original size, and the aura emanating from its body had become several times more powerful. Vaguely, he had already touched the boundary of transcendence, as if there was an extraordinary power brewing in his body. In the face of this situation, the groundhog was both astonished and perplexed. After a short while, it suddenly came to its senses, and it looked up into the sky. Its eyes seemed to be able to pierce through countless barriers, and it caught sight of Luo Fan's clone hovering in midair. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone merely gave it a faint smile. This smile completely flipped the groundhog's mood, and it became extremely excited and expectant. "You're able to reconnect your projection after severing it? What kind of method is that? Please teach me, fellow Taoist." The groundhog immediately knelt down toward the bird and yelled in a loud voice. The bird shuddered slightly upon hearing this, and a smile appeared on its face. "Only I can use this method. I won't be able to teach anyone." A hint of disappointment appeared on the groundhog's face upon hearing this. It was unable to confirm whether Luo Fan was telling the truth or not. However, it was inclined to believe that this was the truth. This wasn't actually an uncommon occurrence. Cultivators had all sorts of strange abilities, and they came from all types of different sources. Some abilities, some divine abilities, because of their special origins and special prerequisites, had all sorts of unique limitations. Only the cultivator who created the ability and divine ability could use it, but this was a common occurrence. At this moment, Luo Fan's method of reconnecting his projection was also this kind of ability or magical ability, so the possibility was not small. In reality, this was the only logical explanation. After all, Luo Fan was able to accomplish something that so many cultivators have been unable to accomplish. So the most likely explanation was that Luo Fan had unleashed a special ability that no one else could achieve. Otherwise, it couldn't be that everyone wasn't smart enough, and only Luo Fan could think of and create this method, right? However, even though Luo Fan couldn't teach it the method to reconnect its projection, the groundhog's attitude toward Luo Fan didn't change drastically. In any case, Luo Fan was able to communicate with the outside world at this point in time. In that case, even if he didn't have any other methods up his sleeve, just this special ability alone was extremely valuable, and it was enough for the groundhog to place its hopes on. He didn't have to do anything else. All he had to do was guide his true body here and expose the existence of this prison to the outside world, and that would be of great help to him. Right at this moment, a thunderous roar suddenly erupted from nearby. Following this thunderous roar, a gust of wind as heavy as a mountain came crashing down toward the bird and the groundhog. In that instant, the groundhog didn't even have a chance to retaliate, and its body was reduced to mincemeat by that gust of wind, thereby perishing on the spot. In contrast, the bird that Luo Fan had transformed into was a different story. In that instant, the feathers on its body fluttered slightly, completely nullifying the gust of wind in an extremely ingenious manner. Even though the gust of wind appeared to be extremely terrifying and was enough to instantly crush the groundhog that even the bird was unable to peck at, it was unable to truly exert any pressure on him. The gust of wind brushed past his body in an extremely gentle manner, and it even gave him an indescribable sense of propulsion, making his body feel a lot lighter during this process. As for any damage, there was no effect at all. At this moment, Luo Fan had also clearly identified the source of the gust of wind. It was a ferocious tiger that was 30 feet in length. This ferocious tiger possessed an extremely powerful, baleful aura, and just by looking at its body, one could sense an indescribable chill welling up from the bottom of one's heart. In fact, one could even smell an extremely strong stench of blood. It was quite clear that this was no ordinary ferocious tiger. This was a ferocious tiger that had already obtained some extraordinary abilities, and it was now able to unleash power that far exceeded that of ordinary, ferocious tigers. At this moment, the ferocious tiger had already arrived above the bird's head, and it opened its massive mouth as it came crashing down toward the bird. The ferocious tiger's breath wasn't unpleasant, and it even contained the faint fragrance of many spirit medicines. However, at this moment, it was obvious that no one could enjoy the fragrance of this spiritual medicine when they were about to be swallowed by this bloody mouth. At this moment, even Luo Fan could only sense the indescribable stench of blood wafting toward him, and he felt as if his entire body had been sealed by an indescribable sense of pressure. As expected, not everyone thinks the same way. At this moment, that was all Luo Fan could think to himself. His figure flashed, and he drew a strange trajectory through the void, dodging the ferocious mouth in the nick of time. In the instant that his body dodged the ferocious mouth, a power that surpassed blood erupted from his body, causing his body to seem to have turned into nothingness, and it was as if he had entered another dimension.